So, and I think some PhD students from Newcastle will join us.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think your PhD graduate long time ago, Ding Guanghui from America will join you as well. I think. Guanghui Ding,
Excellent.
remember him?
Yeah.
I think
Remember
he
well.
will be joining you as well. Yeah.
There is some noise. Can you hear some noise on the line? Oh, it's gone.
Is it gone?
No.
Yeah. Do you
Yeah,
want
it's
to
gone
try
now.
your
It's gone.
slides now, Steve?
Yeah. Okay. I will.
Do the screen share to see.
Okay. Where do I share screen?
I think
Okay.
it's top right hand side.
Yeah. Got it. Try that one. Does that work?
Yeah. Do you want to? Yeah. So can you do the full screen?
Can you see the title page, or what can you see?
I can see a wide, yeah, your title, of course, and the black background on the two sides.
Yeah. Okay. I tell you what, I will put it on a different screen. Just a sec. I'll stop sharing that, and I'll try it on a different screen.
Yeah. Can you have full screen?
No. I'm going to get rid of that. Just a second. No. I know. Right. Am I still with you?
Yeah. I can hear you. I can
Okay.
see it entirely, and but not your screen.
Just a second. I'm just changing screens around because it was too big.
Yeah. By the way, Yixuan, are you there? Yang Yixuan?
Hello. Yeah.
No, the other guy, the student, one of my students. Don't worry about that. Yeah. So, somebody is joining us.
Right. Okay. So I'll try to. No.
对，很多人就是有点那种，你给他的东西太好，他享受不了。Are you okay, Steve?
Yeah, I'm just. Okay. Right. I'm going to try again. Share screen.
On the
there.
top right hand side, yeah, that's much better.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, I have a bit of reverberation now. I don't know, there's some white noise, some background. It's not working.
Yeah, I will ask everybody to mute their microphone.
I have no pictures now. Just a minute.
I can see it, Sheffield.
Oh. Okay, it works now. Can you see those okay?
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah. So,
All right.
哦，没有了，可以了。我把这个学生这个某某人我把他关掉了。对，我把他关掉了。有一个学生。Steve, it's good. It looks great. Eh, 他刚才说话没有 ，Steve？但是他是开着的。现在大家应该都是关掉了。哦，这个人还开着，你看呢 ？Kate，这是谁啊？我给他要不要关？关掉了啊。反正谁都不需要说话嘛，我把它给关掉。我给他 mute。但是我不能有一个按钮叫 mute all， 我一 mute all， Steve 就说话我就听不见了，对吧？哦，才可以可能啊。Steve, can you say a few words? Can I just want to test?
Hi.
Yeah,
I'm
okay.
Steve Parnell
Okay,
in Newcastle, England.
Yeah, good. I can hear you now. Okay, great. Okay.
Good.
我们要不要再等等？现在有几位啊？现在48个。48个。再等一会儿。So Steve, some PhD students from Newcastle cannot attend your lecture, and they want me to record your lecture. Is it okay?
That's fine, yeah.
Yeah, I will keep it circulating only among our PhD students. I mean,
that's
basically
fine, yeah.
my PhD student. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Cheers. 多少人呢？现在51个。差不多。要不要就开始？好 ，OK。Okay, Steve, shall I start now? Shall we?
Okay. Yeah, when you're ready.
I will make a short, brief introduction, but I have to speak in Chinese and then English. Okay, sorry for that. Yeah. OK， 欢迎大家今天来参加我们的这个讲座啊。我们这个讲座呢，昨天和今天这个讲座呢，我们这个讲座是我在这个国美建筑学院开的一个建筑理论课的一个附加的一个活动，就是请2个英国的老师在网上开讲座啊。那么昨天讲的是展览，今天讲的是杂志啊，都是关于媒体的不同的方面啊。好，我现在简单的介绍一下啊，那个。Steve Parnell 呢，2022年已经在我们这儿做过一次讲座，那个时候也是讲的是杂志啊。今天他讲的是一个更新的最新的一个研究啊。他的题目叫一种建筑学的激进 AD 杂志及其履历啊，AD 就是 Architecture Design 啊。然后呢，Steve Parnell 呢是一位研究现代建筑史的独立史学家和作家啊。他是建筑师、大学教师和杂志主编，曾经是英国皇家建筑师学会 IBA 刊物 Journal of Architecture 的主编啊。欧洲建筑研究网络联盟 Architecture Research of the European Network 刊物啊 Journal of Architectural Research AJRA 的主编。伦敦的 Bloomsbury 的出版社将于2026年出版，今年9月将出版他的一本书叫《混凝土 Concrete》。然后美国哈佛大学Harvard Design Press 将于明年9月出版他本次演讲所要介绍的新书啊。他的题目今天演讲的题目就是建筑学的激进 AD 杂志及其履历啊。May I now use English to help and translate what I've just said? Today I have three people joining, two people joining me. Three of us will be chairing together. The first one is Professor Cheng Licao. Yeah, Professor Cheng Licao is Deputy Dean of the School of Architecture. He will join us to chair together with me. And Zhan Xing is academic, young academic at China Academy of Art School of Architecture. She studied at UCL years ago. Okay, so the lecture that I'm introducing today is by Steve Parnell. The lecture will be about journal, and the lecture today on journal and the lecture yesterday on exhibition are all in relation to various issues of media and discourse. And these two lectures are added part of my teaching program here at CAA at Hangzhou. So the lecture today, if I may introduce now in English, is called An Architectural Agonism, a biography of the AD magazine from 1930 to 1992. The speaker is Steve Parnell. Steve Parnell had given a lecture in 2022 at CAA, but today the lecture is on his latest research on AD. Now, a brief introduction of Steve Parnell. Steve Parnell is an independent architectural writer and historian of modern architecture. He has been an architect, academic, and editor-in-chief of the IBA's Journal of Architecture and Architectural Research of European Network Associations, Journal of Architecture Research, AJIAR. Bloomsbury will publish his book Concrete in September 2026 this year, and Harvard Design Press will publish his book, which this lecture is covering. The book will be published next year, September. So Steve, your turn.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, everybody at the China Academy of Art for inviting me to give this lecture.
If I record. Okay. Steve, I'm recording now.
Is that it?
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, good, yeah.
Thank you for inviting me. This is the first time I have tried to put all of my work from the past 20 years or so together into one lecture. So it's a little bit of an experiment. There is a lot to get through, and I'm not used to being translated, so you'll have to advise me when I should stop for translation, if that's okay. Okay.
Sure, we will do it like every few minutes.
Yeah, okay. So you just give me a sign when I need to stop if I go on too long. So the lecture is called Architectural Agonism, which is the title of my book, and it's a term that I've come up with. It's a new term, agonism, which I will explain in the lecture. It's a real word, but we've not used it in architecture before. But it comes out of the writing of the book. So I'll just switch to there we go. So just a little bit about me, because it's important, because it's the background to my research. Over 20 years ago, when I was training as an architect, around 2004, 2005, I wrote a blog called Part 4, which was looking at architecture magazines in practice, because I was working as an architect in practice, and I noticed how important and influential the magazines were in the office. And I wrote a blog as I was training to be an architect, about the culture of architecture, about the culture of the Starchitects, and the way that the magazines worked. Shall I stop there?
Yeah.
Thank you. 首先非常高兴，也很荣幸被邀请来做今天的这个讲座。那么这是我第一次实验性的把我过去所研究的内容尝试整合在一个讲座中，所以这个讲座将会具有一定的试验性，也是第一次的尝试。那么我们这次讲座的主题将会是激进主义建筑学。激进这个词，或者说对抗这个词，它是真实存在的，只是最开始或者说在以往没有被运用到建筑学理论和建筑学的讨论当中。那么我首先想让大家介绍一下我的一个个人的一个情况，这对大家来讲会便于理解后面我们所做的研究的内容。那么在20多年前，我最开始被训练或者说在大学学习成为一个建筑师。在当时我就已经开始写一个 blog， 这个 blog 的内容叫做这个 blog 的名字叫做 Part 4，就是第4部分。那么在这个内容里面呢，其实我就开始讨论和研究建筑文化、建筑杂志以及建筑学在杂志的这个层面是如何去反映一些观念的。Yes.
Steve.
Okay, thank you. The blog became quite famous. We would call it viral today. And led to the architecture magazines themselves inviting me to write for them. And I soon realized that I was better at writing than I was at being an architect, effectively. So I started writing for the architecture magazines, architectural criticism, for British and international architecture magazines, including Architectural Review, Architectural Design, Reaper Journal, and so on. And I've written over 150 articles now for the architectural press, and that's effectively how I practice as an architect now, having given up real practice. But I also realized that I needed some real in-depth study and research into this area of architectural media and architectural magazines. And so I decided to return to Sheffield University to do a PhD on this subject with Professor Peter Blundell-Jones on a specific architecture magazine. I wanted to look at architecture media and its influence on architectural history, and I ended up focusing on this magazine, Architectural Design, under the editorship of Monica Pigeon, who you can see at the top of this slide. I don't know, can you see my cursor on the screen? Does that work? I don't know. Anyway, I'm pointing to Monica Pigeon at the top with my cursor. And she and I looked for my PhD. I looked at her time at the magazine between 1953 and 1973, just 20 years. But the golden period, the golden age of this magazine, which I will go into in more detail shortly. Shall I? I'll just go one step further. And at the end of the PhD won the RIBA President's Award for Outstanding PhD Thesis, and that led Sir David Chipperfield to invite me to do an exhibition based on my research at the 2012 Venice Biennale called Playgrounds and Battlegrounds, where I collected together huge numbers of 4 different magazines: Domus, Casabella, Architectural Review, and Architectural Design. And I put them on display for people to flick through during this period that I was looking at in my PhD. And I also assembled an enormous diagram, which I will go into in more detail shortly, about this period of architecture and showing the relationships between key architects, the magazines, the schools of architecture, their works, the movements, exhibitions, publications, buildings, prizes, and all sorts of, agents, as we call it, in the field of architecture. So I'll leave it there.
那么当我刚才提到的，我在上学的时候就已经写了这个 blog。由于这个 blog 在当时的网上变得非常的火爆，如果大家可以这样形容的话，那么导致IBA Architectural Journal 直接邀请我为他们来撰稿。也是在那个时候，我可能很自觉地发现，我其实更适合当一个建筑学的作者，或者说写作者，相比起设计来说。所以自从那个时候开始呢，我就开始了我的一个对于建筑学，建筑学文化、建筑学、国际建筑的一些评论和书写一些文章。那么在这个过程中，我工作的路途中呢，发现我其实是对这个东西还是这个主题还是比较感兴趣的，然后希望能够进一步的去研究这个建筑媒体作为一种杂志的这个内容，所以我后来回到了谢菲尔德去念了 PhD。那么这个 PhD 的主题呢，就是关于建筑杂志。在多个建筑杂志的研究中呢，最后把我的建筑主题和研究落到了 Architectural Design 这本杂志。那么在这个其中，关注到比较核心的一个建筑师或者说人物是 Monica。那么他这个在1953年到1973年20年间的这个黄金时期，也是Architectural Design 这本杂志的一个黄金时期。那么针对这个时期进行了我的 PhD 的研究和写作。在与此同时呢，2012年的时候。David Chipperfield 邀请我在威尼斯双年展做一个相关的展览。那么在这个展览中，我选择了4个主要的杂志，包括Architectural Review、Architectural Design， 还有 Domus、Isabella 4个杂志。那么在这个展览中，我把所有的研究性的内容呢展现给观者，让大家可以自由的翻阅。接下去。
Thank you.
他那个博士是在 Sheffield 大学，叫 Peter Blondell Jones， 他的手下做的这个博士论文，研究的就是 AD 这个杂志
Thanks. 还有 the final slides。The final slide， 最后一个刚才增加了一张页面，其实是他另外一个作品，有一个时间轴和表格的形式，研究了历史上或者在一定时期内比较重要的建筑师、建筑学校、思潮运动，通过建筑杂志的方式如何影响建筑历史的。那么这个内容他会在后面的讲座中展开。
Steve, could you show the slides before this one, the one in Venice Biennale?
Yeah, these two.
Yeah, that's the one. And there's another one there before Venice Biennale.
No, just these two from the Biennale.
Okay,
that one,
all right, yeah.
and that one.
Yeah, and the diagram in the chat, and the next one is your Okay. You can go ahead now, Steve.
Okay, thank you. So this talk is based on that, and my subsequent work has basically expanded the PhD in 2 directions. It's expanded it back to when the magazine started in 1930 and forward to the postmodern years ending in 1992. So the talk that I'm going to deliver now is basically 2 halves. The first half will be quite theoretical and lots of words, and the second half will be more of a case study of AD magazine and quite a lot of pictures. Because when I started this work, there was no real work on architecture magazines, how to study them, or the theory of how to research them and their position in architecture. And so I had to develop a theory myself of where the media, let's call it magazines because we're talking about the 20th century when magazines were architecture's favorite medium. Obviously, it relates now to the digital and the internet era, but I'm just going to concentrate on the printed press of AD magazine. So there was no theory of how to understand and think about the position of the architecture magazine and the architecture press within architectural culture. So I had to develop a theory of how to think about it and how to study it using the case study of AD magazine, which is very rich in British architecture culture and international architecture culture. And from that, as a kind of side project, developed a history of architecture, a way to understand and read a history of architecture, and also finally an actual theory of architecture from that, which is based on this idea of architectural agonism. And I just want to define this word agonism to start with, because it's an English word, but it's not very well understood. It comes from the Greek agon, which means struggle. And it refers to a political philosophy that views conflict and opposition and struggle as a necessary part of democracy and of thinking about how ideas should be, brought to fruition. Shall I leave it there for translation?
Thanks. 那么在我基于刚才我们谈到的，Can we?
Yeah, Steve, can you show the previous slide? Yes, okay, yeah.
那么基于刚才我们所谈到的这个展览以及研究，我把我研究的这个范围扩展到1930年，就是《Architectural Design》这本杂志开始的年份，一直到 Postmodernism 后现代主义的1992年，所以把我的研究领域也扩大了。在我开始这个 Architectural Agonism 的研究的时候呢，其实没有一个比较成熟或者说既有的理论可以帮助我们来理解或者定义建筑杂志作为一种媒体，或者说作为一种方式来影响建筑历史。所以我在研究的过程中呢，其实用其他的一些理论的方法来帮助我去形成一个研究的方法，并且去理解和表现它如何影响到建筑的文化，不仅是在英国的，也是全球的。那么我今天的演讲也会因此会分成2个部分。第一部分主要是关于理论性的，会有很多定义和名词。第二部分呢，比较偏向于case study， 也就是关注于 architectural design 它的发展过程中的一些实例。那么 next slide。Can we? Yes.
Steve, next.
Yes,
Yeah.
thanks. 但这个词汇，刚才我们讲到的激进主义建筑学呢，或者建筑学的激进主义呢，它的这个词是一个英文的词，但是我们没有很多深入的研究，所以我想为大家介绍一下这个词的词源。它其实是我引用自一个词组，它是 agon。from Greek， 然后来自于 Greek 语言，那代表了一个挣扎或者对抗的一个过程。那么这个观念主要是来自于政治哲学或者说思想里面，要达到一种民主的过程，必须经历一种对抗和斗争和挣扎，才能形成最终的一种民主。所以这个观念非常重要。Thanks.
All right, Steve.
Thank you. So this is really the first time I've aired this idea in public, so I'm very happy for any questions about it and for your feedback. I'm very eager and keen to hear your feedback on how it scans. So I think the first thing to point out is that at least in English and Britain, the word architecture can mean 2 things. It can mean the buildings or the output or product of architects, what architects design, and that's what most people understand architecture to mean most of the time. But it can also, when you talk about architecture, it can also mean the discipline or the profession, or what I call the field of architecture from Pierre Bourdieu, which I'll introduce in a minute. But it's very important that when I'm talking about architecture and the definition of architecture and the theory of architecture, I'm really talking about the discipline or the field of architecture rather than the output or the product, the buildings, in other words. And what I'm trying to do is to understand the mechanics of how architecture is constructed, by which I mean not the buildings. We understand how buildings are constructed, but what I'm trying to understand and get across is how architecture, the discipline or the field, is constructed. And I will need 2 theorists, 2 French sociologists to help in this theory. The first one, which I used in my PhD, was Pierre Bourdieu. And he's written an awful lot about culture and art, but not about architecture. So we've adopted this idea of his ideas about sociology into architecture, based largely on this book Distinction, which was translated into English in 1984, but was written in French in the 1970s. And this his ideas include the idea of architecture as a field or culture as a field or a discipline. And importantly, that the field itself is the creator or the constructor of architecture. So it's not the individual agents inside the field. So when I'm talking about agents, I mean individuals like architects and critics or clients or patrons, or even institutions such as the RIBA or the magazines or educational institutions. All of these are agents that act in the field of architecture and create a field that is the creator. It constructs architecture. And the game, as Pierre Bourdieu calls it, the game that is played is the struggle to accrue or to gain cultural capital within this field. So the more cultural capital you gain, the more powerful you become. And Bourdieu talks about different types of capital. He talks about social capital, which means the people you know, your networks, your relationships, and so on. He talks about obviously financial capital, which is the most famous type of capital, the amount of money you have. And he talks about cultural and symbolic capital, which relate to your power within a cultural field, such as art, music, or even architecture. And all of these types of capital are translatable from one to another. You can translate money into, I don't know, cars. You can translate money into power, and culture into power, and so on, cultural capital into power. So the general idea of Pierre Bourdieu that I've adopted is the idea that agents are struggling within the field of architecture, to accrue, to gain cultural capital in order to be able to say what architecture is, in order to be able to define architecture, in order to be able to essentially control architecture on their terms. I'll leave it there before I introduce Bruno Latour.
Yeah, may I go before
Thank you.
previous slides? Yeah, so
Can you show the previous one? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. 那么我认为我们在讨论建筑学这个定义的时候，特别在英文里，我们定义 architecture， 它其实有两种解释方法，一种是认为我们的建筑物或者说建筑师的创造物它是建筑，第二个定义是这个学科这个职业以及建筑学所影响的场域。那么在我的讲座里，我更关注的是第二个定义，也就是这个学科领域和建筑学所关注的场域。
Next slide, Steve. Yeah.
那么我提出的问题其实在于说，建筑学这个学科和这个建筑学的所谓的场域，它是如何被构建的？它构建的媒介是什么
Steve, next slide, please.
那么在这个过程中，在形成这个定义和研究的过程中，我将引用两位学者的研究和借用他们在社会学的一些定义。那么第一个学者就是皮埃尔Bourdieu，他是一个法国的社会学家。那么在他的定义中，有一个非常重要的观念，就是 field 是作为一种场域或者说是一种领域。那么这个领域本身作为一种学科和profession 就 architecture 的一种形成的动力，或者说是它来形成建筑的。那么他的一本书，我们在这里引用的是这个 distinction， 我们在1984年被翻译成了英文的著作，那么翻译成中文应该是区隔的意思。那么它的一个非常重要的，就是这个字可以这样翻，就是这个字可以翻译成区隔。如果说要翻译的话，大家也可以就是 distinction 来理解。那么它的这个定义就是说，我们有很多 agents 或者参与者在这个 field 里面，在这个场域里面，每个人都是要通过他自己的一种抗争。刚才我们说的这个 struggle 或者说是agon 去抗争，然后去达到他对这个学科定义的影响，试图去获得一种文化资本，或者说是去获得一种积累。那么这种积累，这种文化资本和积累可以转化成一种力量，去定义他们所认为的建筑是什么，或者说去表达他们的建筑观念。那么在这个 Bourdieu 的观念里面，它有很多种所谓的资本，就是很多种 capital， 其中包括了 cultural capital， 包括了文化资本，然后还有社会资本，以及其他的象征资本。社会资本可能指的更多的是你在社会中的人脉，关系网络。那么文化资本也包括了一些 认知，比方说是艺术的认知，或者说其他的一些知识性的定义。那么在这种不同的资本之间，它是可以互相转化的。
我再补充一下哈，就是这个理论呢，在借用Pierre Bourdieu 的理论，这个理论呢，这个重要的书就 distinction 啊，有很多翻法，我不知道中文有没有翻，肯定中国人都有，社会学一定有人在研究这个书，肯定的啊。distinction 我们可以翻成杰出哈，比较通俗的叫杰出啊。杰出是个问题，就是优秀是个问题啊，这是个问题啊。OK， 那么它就几个概念，一个是 field 就是领域啊，建筑学是一个领域。那么领域是真正的界定者或者创造者啊，有几个基本概念，还有一个概念就是在这个领域里面有一些能动的行为者或者能 agent 啊，一种推动者。这个推动者可以是个人，比如说建筑师，或者是那个批评家，也可以是机关，比如说学校，比如说这个杂志社或者出版社，或者是什么，或者是杂志本身，或者是杂志的出版社，或者是协会，有很多机关啊，它也是一种推动者。然后呢，它整个领域呢有个 struggle，它要努力的创造文化资本啊，它是有意义的、有用的啊，等等等等，就是创造文化资本，努力的创造文化资本，并且获得一种权利啊。这里面有个重要的问题，就是谁能够来定义什么叫建筑啊？这里面有这么一个问题啊。好 ，Steve。
Thank you. So these diagrams that I developed for the Biennale are effectively a visualization of this field of architecture, and all of the lines, the grey lines, are the agents, and the buildings and the magazines and the exhibitions and so on are all agents within this field. It's my kind of interpretation of a field, which I will expand on in a little minute. The next sociologist that I mentioned is Bruno Latour. Now, he wrote about 20 years or so later than Bourdieu on this idea of reassembling the social. And he developed this theory of actor network theory, or ANT, A-N-T. He uses slightly different language. He calls agents actors, but you can effectively think of them as the same thing. But his kind of big idea was to focus on the relationships between these actors or agents in the field, and to level the hierarchy between the human and the non-human. So in other words, abstract the field into different agents or actors, whether these agents are magazines, people, clients, historians, buildings, movements, etc., groups. They should all be thought about on the same level, because they all have relationships and they all influence and affect each other within the field of architecture. So here's the big idea that I've taken from Latour is the idea that objects too have agency. So magazines, buildings, and so on also have agency as much as people within this field. And focusing finally on this idea of biographies or life histories and the relationships between these life histories. So the idea that a magazine like AD can have a biography, does have a life, it has a beginning, it goes through the world, it affects things that it passes through, it has an agency within the world. And it's important to understand that this agency is relational, that just as people have relationships with each other, people have relationships with non-human objects as well, which in turn has an agency on them. So we all affect everybody else and everything else within this field of architecture. And this is a diagram. Again, this is one of my very, very early kind of sketches of this idea of the field of architecture, from which the exhibition diagram was taken, where I started to look. This was before I'd come across Latour. I was just sketching out how people and things were related in the field, including the magazines Architectural Review and Architectural Design. You can see lots of people, architects especially, in this diagram, and how they are related through things like writing for magazines, being involved in magazines, being involved in movements, being involved in exhibitions, being involved in educational, whether as a student or as a teacher, being involved in employment and practices, and basically trying to sketch out how they were all related. Shall I leave it at that?
Can we go to previous slides, please?
Steve, the previous one. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. 那么第二个学者，我在研
That
究
one?
中，
No, the next one. Yeah, yeah, stay here. Yeah.
第二个学者，我们所引用的他的一个观念，其实和刚才说的布埃尔的布迪欧的理论也是有一些相关性，都是在讨论社会是如何被构成的。那么拉托尔的这个理论里边比较重要的是指我们在这个行动者的这个 actor 和 agents 其实有一种相似性，我们可以用同样的方式去理解它。那么在他的这个理论中，我所关注的是在人物之外还有非人的一些元素，比方说杂志，比方说其他的一些机构，它都可以作为一种行动者参与到定义建筑领域的这个工作中来，或者这个事件中来。所以非人的物体同样也是一种行动者。那么在他的观念里，还有一个非常重要的理论呢，就是相当于说我们要以平等的态度来对待人和非人的物之间的关系，来平等的看待他们对建筑的影响。在这个过程中呢，还有一个关于 relational biographies 的传记的一个讨论，也就是说，不是人才有传记，其实这个杂志，比方说 Architectural Design AD 这个杂志，它就可以有自己的一个传记，但这种传记它一定不是孤立的，它是 relational 的，就是和其他的事物发生关联的，可以是人和物的关联，也可以是物和物的关联，它们互相影响。Thanks. Next slide, please.
Next, Steve.
如图所示，我们这边看到的其实是我最开始尝试去描绘或者说是 visualize， 把它展现出来。我刚才所说的这种关系，那么在这个关系里面，包括了像中间圈子里看到的 architectural review、architectural journal、architectural design， 这些是物的部分。那么其他一些人物出现在这张表中，比方说他是为这些杂志撰写文章的人物，或者说他的内容出现在这些杂志当中。那么通过这种关系，形成了一个可以看见的场域领域。Thank you.
Okay, so you can see in the key at the top left that I'm trying to relate people through employment, education, friendship, family, and so on. And I noticed that this is focusing on the post-war years in British architecture, of course. That was my PhD. That was my research. But I noticed that there were appearing some very, very influential and important people in this diagram. So one figure that nobody knows in architecture is this figure called Philip Morton Shand, who was an aristocrat, basically. He was a very wealthy man related to the aristocracy in Britain. And he wrote he was a man of taste, he was a wine collector, connoisseur. He wrote about all sorts of cultural things, but he wrote a little bit about architecture, and he knew some modern architects, including Alvar Aalto and Gropius in Germany. He translated some of their work into English, and he got through 4 wives, and the daughters of him and his wives married people who became very influential. So, for example, his first daughter, Mary Shand, married James Stirling, who was one of the most important and best architects in the post-war years in the UK, and he won the Rieber Gold Medal in 1990, I think. But also, Philip Morton Shand, with later wives, had other children, and one of those, Elspeth Shand, married Sir Geoffrey Howe, who nobody will know, but Sir Geoffrey Howe was the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the British government under Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, an incredibly powerful position in government. And also, perhaps most surprisingly, another of Philip Morton Shand's sons, Bruce Shand, is the father of Camilla Shand, who is now known as Camilla Parker Bowles and is now actually the Queen of England because she married the Prince of Wales. So through this sketching of diagrams, relational biographies, I soon discovered that James Stirling, fantastic architect, was related directly to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, one of the most important political positions in the UK, and the future King of England. And this really woke me up and opened my eyes to the ways that architecture works through this kind of, that's what Bourdieu would call social capital, the relationships of people to each other. And this was confirmed when I looked at Ancestry and tried to find kind of, real bloodlines between these people, and they were indeed related. And Howard Robertson, another architect, was also related to Philip Morton Shand. So, shall I? Okay, sorry, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, can we go to the previous slides? Yes, thank you. 那这张图在左边的图例上，其实我用不同的线条表示了就是雇佣关系、教育关系、朋友关系、亲属关系。那么在红色圈圈里，其实刚才教授举例的一个人物是 Philip Morton Shand， 但这个人物其实经常不是非常显著，但是在找到他以后，发现他跟很多人都有关系。首先他自己是个收藏家，也是个作家，但是他对建筑的描写，写作者对建筑的描写比较写作比较少，更多的是关于艺术。那么他有4任妻子，其中一个女儿，是与 James Stirling 结为夫妇的，所以James Stirling 是一个非常重要的建筑师，非常重要的一个人物。那么他还有其他的亲属，比方说女儿和儿子也和英国社会里面非常重要的一些代表性的人物，包括Prince of Wales，就是有一个亲属关系或者说婚姻关系。所以说我们发现这样子的刚才所提到的一种 social capital， 就是社会资本，其实对人际关系的这种利用，包括它隐含的一种线索，对形成建筑的这个领域是非常有影响的。然后
这里面就是有个叫 Jeffrey Howe 啊，是 Jeffrey Howe， 他是财政部长，前几任的财政部长，就是这个 Steve Parnell 他的研究里面发现了很多人和人的关系，然后他发现有个叫 Philip Morton Shand， 这个人大家都不太知道，但这个人呢，他家庭背景非常的富裕吧，然后他的关系，他的女儿怎么还是他的几任妻子的孩子儿子和女儿跟很多人都有各种关系吧，然后呢其中一个就是一个女儿嫁给了 James Stirling 啊。然后呢，又是他的第2个夫人还是第3个夫人的女儿，又是Jeffrey Howe， 又是婚姻关系吧。然后又是谁？又是跟 Prince Wales， 这个威尔士这个现在是国王啊，他又是一个什么家庭关系是吧？是结婚了还是怎么？好，一句话他就发现这个人的网络里面有很多人其实是连在一起的。一个是著名的建筑师叫 James Stirling 啊，一个是重要的一个财政部长是 Jeffrey Howe， 还有一个就是英国的皇室这种关系啊。好 ，Steve。
Okay, thank you. So that was a quick example. Effectively, what I'm trying to do is retrieve architectural history from art historical methods. Art history, so an architectural history based on art historical methodologies thinks of architecture as an object. It thinks of the architect as the author. It thinks of aesthetic classification, the periodization of styles, teleological progress, and so on. And these are the usual ways that architectural history is taught in the schools of architecture. But I want to think of it in a completely different way and reject this idea of architecture as art history, but as a more sociological way. In these agonistic terms, we think of architecture as the palimpsest or the trace of agonism. In other words, we think of the buildings as the residue or the debris of the struggle to define architecture. And that really is kind of the approach that I'm taking to thinking about architecture and its history. Okay, I'll go on a little bit further. Part of this is the idea, the theory of architecture magazines. So very quickly, we're talking about 20th century here, of course, but it does apply equally to the 21st century and digital and internet technologies. But the idea that magazines have a currency, by which I mean that they come out every month or every 2 months or every 3 months. And as I was in practice and as I saw, we passed magazines around the office, we looked at what was, the latest projects, competitions, news, gossip, and so on. They were very influential. Less influential now because of digital magazines, but it's just a different form of transmission. But these physical printed magazines, they had a short life, first life, as long as they were the current issue or the latest issue. And then when the next issue came out, the previous magazines were shelved. They were put into purgatory on the shelf. And then finally they would be sent off and bound like a book, which you can often find in the library now. And then it's stored or archived as an archive of architectural knowledge, which, you know, in places like Newcastle University, you have to go to a completely different building in order to find. So there's this huge, immense archive of architectural knowledge that is stored away in a different building that's basically hidden because it's largely not digitized. Some of these magazines are digitized slowly, like the Architectural Review, but most of them are not. So it's a huge archive of knowledge that's hidden away. So the magazine effectively has an afterlife, as Andrew Peckham has called it. And it's this afterlife that I think we want to try and retrieve in order to inform us of what was happening in architecture at the time, because otherwise it's completely forgotten.
尝试探索一种重新定义或者研究建筑史的一种方法。这种方法呢是避免运用一种建筑历史研究的方法去定义不同的建筑师、建筑以及它的类型风格、它的时代的审美分类等等等等。这种方法呢是往往我们在建筑学院里常用的一种传统的方法。然后我试图用一种新的理解方式。Next slide, please. Yeah， 它是通过这个激进主义或者说是激进化的这个研究方法，来尝试理解建筑作为一种抗争和对抗的线索，或者说它的一个路径。那么房屋或者说建筑物作为这种抗争和挣扎的残留物，或者它的一个产物。
它有个意思，就是说建筑历史在历史上，建筑历史就是艺术史的一个部分，所以呢，建筑历史的方法的思路是艺术史的方法和思路，那么就会把建筑研究看的是建筑师他的伟大的作品，然后呢，就把建筑师作为一个创造者，作为一个主体，然后研究这个创造的作品啊，这就是比较传统的，就是建筑师作为作者，然后他的伟大的作品，然后呢，等等等等各种方法，然后他打了个叉。就他要放弃或者挑战这种传统的建筑史作为艺术史的传统的观念，要把它看成是一个社会的存在啊，各种社会的各种问题啊，各种社会的挣扎啊、努力啊，各种从社会的角度去看去研究啊，然后呢转过来就讲第二个问题，就是这个杂志的几种生存的杂志的几个生命嘛啊，你接着翻译。
那么这一页 slides this one is 说的是关于我们杂志的一个流通性和它的一个生命旅程吧，可以说是一个流通这样的翻译，而不是货币。那么它第一个时期是短暂的，在刚刚被发布的时候，1周、1个月，甚至就是2到3个月的时间内，它是被人们所关注到的。那么在这个时期短暂的流行期过去以后，它被进行了一个清理或者整理，被归档。在归档的过程中呢，它们作为一种档案或者说建筑的知识，产生了第2重生命。那么第3重生命呢，可能会在之后被作为一种可以在网上搜索到的信息，但实际上我们大部分的杂志都没有被数据化，所以某种程度上它们被掩盖了、被隐藏了。有一部分被数据化的呢，可能会用来作为人工智能的一种训练的材料。所以在这个对比中呢，我们网上的这种被数字化的这个杂志或者知识呢，实际上获得了永恒的生命。
他这里很有意思啊，他说这个杂志就是我们平常的纸媒哈，它有几个生命，第一个生命是很短的，就是1个星期1个月就完了，然后就放起来就不看了啊。然后它有个第2个生命，就是它把它打包成1年把它放起来，然后像一本书一样，然后就放在一个仓库里面。然后呢，这个时候它就获得了永恒的生存啊，就会一直存在下去。然后呢，还有一个生命呢，就是它现在越来越被数字化。digitize， 然后数字化以后呢，再放到网上，就可能会构成一种那个人工智能的一个获取的一个读物吧，就是 LLM， 就是 Large Language Model 啊，就是巨大的语言模型那个阅读的，对，大语言模型那个。然后他最后有一句话，他说 网络上的杂志只有一个生命，就是永恒的生命永恒的表面，永恒的瞬间 ，eternal ephemerality， 永恒的瞬间OK，Steve, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I included this because I just think it's interesting to compare how we search for and retrieve knowledge and store and construct knowledge nowadays using digital technologies and artificial intelligences compared to how not very long ago architects constructed and stored and retrieved knowledge through paper technology, effectively, the books and the magazines. I'm not going to go into the digital technology side, but I think it's an interesting exercise to do that. And the theories I contest still hold, albeit that a digital life is very different to a physical life, whether it's a magazine or a human, of course. Anyway, I will move on. If anybody is interested in researching architecture magazines, this book is quite hard to find. It's from Canada, but it's from a conference on architectural periodicals in the 1960s and 1970s. It's about 20 years old, edited by Hélène Janière, Alexis Sornin, and Frans van Latham. And they were the first and the only people I've really found who thought about the methodologies of how to go about researching architecture magazines. And they wrote briefly about this, and they divided histories of architecture magazines into two, which they said one aims to write the history of architecture magazines, while the other aims to write history of architecture by exploiting this type of relatively accessible document. By which they mean magazines and books are relatively accessible. You can go to the library and find them fairly easily and discover what was written there. Whereas the other type of architecture history through magazines is to write the history of architecture magazines. And this is what Beatriz Colomina did about 2007, around the same time, in her and her PhD group's exhibition and book called Clip, Stamp, Fold, where they looked at the radical architecture of little magazines in the 1960s and 1970s, the same period as this conference looked at. But they looked at little magazines, by which they meant the avant-garde magazines which were temporary, very cheaply produced, did not rely on advertising, were basically sort of manifestos for the groups that produced them. And this was quite a famous and a spectacular exhibition, but it was a history of architecture magazines. So it's talking about the architecture magazines. And then the other type of history that Janière and Van Latham talked about were histories through what I call histories through architecture magazines, by which they mean that the histories are kind of constructed by the historians, and then they use the magazines as evidence to back up their claims to write the stories and the narratives that they want to write. So they're not led by the magazines, they're led by the historians' knowledge and research, but they use the magazines as kind of evidence to back it up. And these books that I'm showing here, The New Brutalism, famously by Rainer Banham, or Nick Bullock's Building the Post-War World, or the one I showed earlier, Schmiedeknecht and Peckham's Modernism and the Professional Architectural Journal, are just three of very many, and it's the very normal way of writing architecture histories through architecture magazines, led, as I say, by the people who want to write them. And the final way that I will show in the next half of the talk is this biography of AD magazine, which I call History from Architecture Magazines. And this is a third way that I've kind of come up with to think about how we can write architecture histories from architecture magazines, which is to look at the magazine as the primary source of the narrative, to really inspect very, very closely the content and the relational biographies of the people who put together the magazines, and to let that lead the narrative rather than kind of impose a narrative on the magazine. So placing the architecture magazine, the printed architecture magazine, at the very center of this process to lead the narrative from there and see where it goes. Not only the printed page, but the people behind it and the biographies of the people and their relationships and how they thought about architecture and how they argued and promoted what they considered architecture should be. I'll go back to there.
或者建筑杂志，在过去的一些议题比较感兴趣的话，这里有一本书也是我们比较关注的，是来自法国的两位作者Jenny and Sonny。那么他们在这本杂志里面，这本书籍里面其实收集了1960年代、1970年代的杂志期刊。那么在这个里面有两个对于建筑历史和建筑杂志的讨论，一个是一方面是通过对建筑杂志研究去书写建筑杂志的历史，就是 History of Architecture Magazine。然后另外一些呢是试图通过建筑杂志的这种类型去利用，或者说是充分利用它的这个比较容易使用的一种媒介，去重新书写建筑的历史。是这样子的一种定义，就是阐释。
他说了4种啊，我其实没有完全记住第一种他是说第2种是关于杂志的历史，关于建筑杂志的历史，第2种，第3种是通过第2个是关于建筑杂志的历史，第3种是通过杂志去研究建筑第4种是通过从建筑杂志中去研究建筑然后把杂志看成是建筑历史本身的必然的一部分第一部分应该就是最简单的，就杂志和书就放那，你就去看去那就是实际上就是它的大概是第一种Steve。
Okay. There are 2 papers which I've written to try and explain this approach, which I will pass on. You can take a note now, or I will pass on the links later. But to move on to the second half of the talk and leave the theory behind, which we can talk about later maybe. I'm going to talk about AD magazine itself and this history from the magazine Architectural Design from between 1930 and 1992. So it's quite a quick romp through history, through 62 years of British architectural history as sort of narrated by the magazine itself. That's just a little bit of fun, a little play on words. But Alison Peter Smithson wrote an article called "Today We Collect Ads." But the point really is that adverts and advertising was fundamentally important for AD, for architectural design, from the very beginning, because the financial basis upon which it could exist was paid for by the manufacturers of building products. And its life begins way back at the beginning of the 20th century, when the founders, C.P. Moss and Samuel Dottridge, went to America and came across Sweet's catalogue, which is quite a famous catalogue, but it was a catalogue of building components. And obviously at the beginning of the 20th century, buildings were becoming more complicated, and building products and manufacturers were making more complicated products to create these more complicated buildings. And they had to inform the architects of the benefits of their products, whether it's, I don't know, a different type of steel or brick or glass or, you know, all sorts of things, concrete, all sorts of technical wonders. But they issued catalogues of all sorts of different size and complexities to architects, and architects were overwhelmed with the information. They couldn't cope with the amount of information. So this guy called Sweet, who had produced an architecture magazine called the Architectural Record in America, produced a catalogue of manufacturers' components. And when the founders of AD went to America, they saw this and they brought the idea back to Britain in 1907, and they wanted to create an exhibition of building products called a building centre, which still exists in London today. And they created the centre in Bloomsbury, and they realized that people couldn't necessarily visit London very easily in 1907, 1908. So they produced a paper version of it called the Architect's Standard Catalogues. And this isn't the first one, but way back in the early 20th century, they produced these enormous books that basically compressed manufacturers' information about their products into a standard size and format for architects to understand and be able to specify for the buildings that they were designing. So this started out in, I think, around 1910, 1913, and they produced several of these enormous catalogues every 4 or 5 years to update architects on the latest building products. And architectural design and construction, this magazine on the right, this orange magazine, came out in 1930 first, November 1930, on the back of these architect standard catalogues. So you can imagine that these standard catalogues were very dry information, like adverts, basically. And they wanted to keep, they were so popular, they sold so many and became very rich. They bought a whole printer, a print works, to produce these standard catalogues and to keep the print works busy between these long periods when they weren't producing these enormous catalogues. They decided to produce a monthly magazine, a semi-social magazine, to keep and stay connected with the architects who were buying these very expensive, very large standard catalogues. So it started out, and they were given away for free to the subscribers of the standard catalogue. They were issued as a free kind of gift to just keep in touch on a social level with these architects from November 1930. I'll go back.
那么我们回到刚才的讨论，就是最后一种类型，我们说的是 histories through architectural magazines， 这也是将我们后面围绕 AD 的一些历史，在通过这个研究 AD 的历史去理解建筑史中一些关键的人物和他们的言论的对塑造建筑历史的影响。那么我们现在这有一个 quote 是 But today we collect ads。这个 AD 其实有一种双关，一个是 architectural design， 另外一个其实实际上它指的是 advertising， 就是我们的广告。那么这个杂志的创始人在20世纪初1907年的时候创立了这个杂志，其实是来源于他们去美国看到了一种商品手册或者说图录。这种图录呢，我们现在左边看到这个 Sweets 这个人，他创造了一个 The Architectural Record， 里面其实是容纳了建筑相关产物或者说是生产商制造的一些建筑配件、一些建筑材料。那么这种材料呈现了当时的最新的可以供建筑师使用的这些内容。所以当这些AD 杂志的创始人回到英国了，他们就想到一个想法，是创造一个展览，能够把这些产品、建筑产品相关的产品材料展现给大家。那么也就是我们后来的 Building Center， 这个 Building Center 到现在也在伦敦还是有的。但是当时发现，其实对于公众来讲，他们很难实际到达这个场馆去了解这些产品。所以在此之后，他们尝试用创造 catalog 的方法，也就是最开始的 Architecture Standard Catalog。The next page， 有2个非常大部头的书。那么它这是4到5年期间，就是每4到5年它会更新一次。近期在行业内新的产品、新的材料、新的技术。那么在1910年到1913年期间是这样的方式，一直到后期他们买了专业的印刷设备，那么在没有印刷这个书籍的期间呢，想到了一个方法，就是说做一些月度的这些期刊，这些期刊。最开始是免费提供给他们行业内圈内的人，来保持一种社会上的一种联系，创造一些可以共同共享的一些信息。那么也就是在1930年开始做了 Architectural Design 这个小的一个册子。Construction
Architecture Design and Construction
是那个小的册子。
对对对，基本上的意思都翻过去了，就是这个 catalog 这个怎么这个建筑样品的那个什么建筑设计的。各种部件的那个集资料集吧，这种这图录每4、5年要更新一次，然后呢量非常大，然后呢卖得非常非常好，非常挣钱，然后他们把一个印刷厂给买下来了，就专门做这个，他们就是非常有钱，然后就想，同时也因为这种图集非常枯燥嘛，所以搞一个这种比较好看的、比较有趣味的这个小小的建筑设计和构造的一个杂志而且一开始是免费的好。 Okay, Steve.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I think the point to bear in mind from the origins of architectural design is the fact that its purpose was not to disseminate a particular ideology or to say what architecture should be. Its purpose was to sell building manufacturers' products and to keep architects happy and building manufacturers happy and to keep in touch with the architects. It was essentially a byproduct of advertising, if you like. Its first editor, we know very little about. It's very difficult to find anything about the first editor. But it was this architect, John Kendall. He was the editor for just a very brief time, November 1932, 1932. And he was a traditionalist architect from a high social class and didn't really, he kept the magazine going, but he didn't really move it in any particular direction other than invite his cronies to write about funny anecdotes in a social kind of manner. But the next editor was the person who really took it in a scientific humanist direction, in a very modern direction. That was Frederick Towndrow, known as Tony Towndrow, from his time in the First World War. And he was from a lower social class, but he worked his way up through the army, through the military, and then became an architect and had a very progressive scientific and social progressive kind of attitude, humanist attitude to architecture. And he was one of the first modern architects in London and in Britain. And on the right, you can see one of the houses that he designed around 1930, very early modern architecture. And he was the editor. He took over from John Kendall when John Kendall died in 1932. He took it over, and it became quite a technical magazine at that point. But it was a magazine that tried to promote architecture as a sort of social endeavor through the technological progress. And then during the Second World War, he was conscripted to the Ministry of Works because of his experience. And that's when Monica Pigeon, who was a family friend, took over, or rather ghosted in the background for Tony Towndrow from 1941. This is some pages from her scrapbooks, which I've seen from her daughter. And she basically put together this enormous scrapbook of her life, which is an amazing object in itself. But she was born in Chile, in South America, of all places, in 1913. She went to a Scottish mother and an English father. They were well off, and they went to university in England, in UCL in the Bartlett. She went to start architecture there, but she wasn't really interested in architecture. She was only really interested in dancing and having a good time. And she transferred to interior architecture or interior design. And she got what she called a useless diploma at the end of it. Didn't really know what to do with her life, but she ghosted for Tony Towndrow during the war in 1941. And that's how she became involved in architectural design. It says 1946 to 1975 there. That's when I looked at her period in the magazine for my PhD, but actually she started in 1941, as her scrapbook says on the right there.
OK， 那么刚才前面几页，我们提到的是关于这个 AD 杂志，它最开始实际上并不是作为一种传播建筑理念和建筑观念的一个阵地，它只是作为一种刚才我们提到的一种图册，让这个建筑产品的这个制造商和建筑师都能获得足够的信息，让他们都开心。最开始是这样子的一个方法。那么最初期1930年到32年的这个编辑是 John Kendall， 那么他是来自于英国上层社会，也是一个建筑师，但是从对建筑杂志的影响来讲，没有太大的一种改变，还是保持原来的这个核心的内容。那么对 AD 杂志产生巨大影响的是 Frederick Towndrow 或者是 Tony Towndrow， 那么他也是作为一个建筑师，在1932年到1941年期间，作为他的第二任编辑，也在1930年代 那时候是一个一战前期。那么在1930年很早的时期就建制一个具有现代主义风格的这个作品。那么在他之后，是我们刚才提到的非常重要的一个人物是 Monica Pigeon。那么这个女士她在早期的时候也是在1941年接任了第二位编辑，作为 AD 杂志的这个编辑。Next slides, please.
That's it.
Next slide, Steve.
That one? You want me to continue?
Thank you. 所以我们
Okay,
看到
thank
这
you.
位女士，她在很早期的时候就开始用一种拼贴布的方法，做一些信息的组织，包括她自己的一些想法就记录。那么这个拼贴本或者说剪贴布本身也是一个非常特别、非常有价值的作品，或者说是一个内容。那么在她1913年到1931年期间呢，她其实也进入了我们刚刚提到UCL Ballet Architecture School 去学习建筑，但是她也是一个非常活跃的人物，很喜欢跳舞，很喜欢参加其他的工作，所以在后期的学习中呢，实际上她转向了室内设计这个方面。那么在1941年之后，一战开始之后，也进入了编辑的领域，开始作为 AD 的编辑。那么最开始在我的 PhD 研究中，我所标注的一个时期是1946年到1975年，实际上他从1941年就开始担任 AD 的编辑了。
Okay, Steve.
Thank you. So Monica Pigeon was actually born, her name was Grizel Lehman. Grizel is a very ugly name, and she preferred Monica, a Spanish name. So that's really an adopted name. And Lehman was her birth name, but she married the architect Raymond Pigeon, who she met at UCL. She married him in 1936. He worked for T.P. Bennett, and they got divorced in 1946 after the war. But they had two children, Carl and Annabelle. But Monica was not very domesticated. She didn't want to be a housewife. She was a very social person, and that's how she basically ran AD magazine. She was the figurehead at the top who connected people. She admitted herself that she wasn't a good designer, but she could see what was good design and who were good designers. And she had a talent for spotting who were the latest, greatest people. So she used her talents for networking and socializing for the CIAM conference in 1947, which was held in the UK in Bridgewater. This is a photograph that Monica organized, put together. It's quite a famous photograph of all the big, great names in architectural history. We have Le Corbusier, for example, all the way over there, circled in red on the left. We have Walter Gropius, Sert, we have Gideon right there in the center. But we can also actually see Monica Pigeon herself is centered right there, front and center, next to her assistant editor or co-editor, Barbara Randall. And she put herself right in the kind of center of the picture, literally next to Gideon and Sert, who were the kind of secretary and president of CIAM. In comparison, you see on the back row, Jim Richards or James Richards, who was the editor of the Architectural Review, very, high profile architect and critic and historian, but he's there way on the back row. So this kind of idea of social capital really played out for Monica Pigeon as she organized the network and the world of architecture. And we can see that in this picture that was a record of a very important meeting after the war of CIAM, where the great and good of architecture basically got together in order to decide how the world would be reconstructed after the devastation of the war. And Monica Pigeon, so Frederick Towndrow, who she ghosted for, left to take up a professorship in Australia after the war. And Monica Pigeon, with Towndrow's assistant editor, Barbara Randall, who we see in the middle of this slide here, basically took on the magazine themselves from 1946 onwards. It was obviously a struggle to keep the magazine going. There was very little work, there was very little money at that time in the years of austerity immediately after the war. And Barbara Randall left to have children, left to the country in 1953. It says 1954 there, but that's wrong. 1953 was when Theo Crosby took over as the first technical editor. which is really when the magazine got going. I mean, in the immediate post-war period, there was a push for ideas of modularization and standardization and kind of technicalization of architecture with these building products. AD was still very much part of the standard catalog company, still advertising building manufacturers' products. That's how it survived effectively, with very few people working on it. But Monica Pigeon and her network, her social network, was able to pull in favors from people to write for the magazine, including her husband and other people she knew at university, to keep the magazine going through these very difficult years. And the focus was very much on kind of standardization and modularization of building components in that time. And then 1953 is the next period that I'll talk about, when Theo Crosby comes and replaces Barbara Randall as the co-editor.
这张照片里，是非常重要的一张照片，也是在国际现代建筑大会里面所拍摄的一张照片。可以看到红圈标出的都是在现代建筑历史上非常重要的一些人物，比方说最左边大家都可以认出是柯布西耶，那么还有古洛皮乌斯，还有基蒂恩。那么在两个红圈中间有的女士，她其实就是Pigeon 她本人，她就坐在第一排的正中间，旁边基蒂恩跟这个协会的主席应该是在正中的位置。那么我们可以看到后面还有一个人物是 Architectural Review 的编辑，那么也是非常重要的一本杂志的这样子的一个编辑和学者，他都在最后一排，所以可见Monica Pigeon 她其实作为一个编辑，她的社交的关系网非常的好，她也非常擅长去组织大家进行这样重要的一种交流和会议，去维系各界的重要的这个建筑师在一个信息网络里面。Thank you. Next page. Next slide. Yeah. 所以自1953年，他应该是离开了这个英国，但是这个杂志最开始是有持续的在进行一个生产或者说是写作，但是在杂志在 Architectural Design 工作的人其实非常少，所以依靠Pigeon 他自身的一些能力、社交的朋友圈来招引一些供稿人来撰写杂志的一些文章。那么在下一个这个 next slide please。这个在这一页中，我们其实可以看到，在1953年的时候，我们在AD 杂志里面看到的，更多的是关于模块化、魔术化，以及标准化的一些推崇。这个也是由于建筑在技术方面它的一些技术的影响，或者说更加推崇技术化的方法来宣传，或者说是推崇一些建筑产品和它的材料。Thank you.
Okay. So the magazine became known as Architectural Design in 1946 when Monica Pigeon took over. She got rid of the "and construction" part of the title. Frederick Tandrow was very much, like I say, a technical person, wrote about construction and how buildings went together a lot. But Monica Pigeon was more interested in the design and the cultural side of architecture. So it became known as Architectural Design. And as I said, Barbara Randall left and they advertised for a replacement, and Theo Crosby was chosen as the next co-editor, and he became the first technical editor. Now, Theo Crosby was a South African architect. He trained in South Africa, and he was incredibly tall, but he drove tanks during the war in Italy, and his taste of Italy gave him a taste of Europe and kind of the old world, the classical world of architecture. And he wanted to come back as soon as he finished his degree after the war. He came back to London in order to holiday in Italy, basically. And on one of those trips in Italy, in Florence, at the Biblioteca Lawrenziana, he by chance bumped into Peter Smithson, and they became best friends. And when they went back to London to live, they moved into a flat together. And Peter Smithson had finished his degree at Durham University, which is now Newcastle University. His girlfriend, Alison Smithson, was still there. And stayed connected. And when Alison came down and moved in with them in London, Thea Crosby moved into the flat upstairs. But the three of them, Alison, Peter Smithson, and Thea Crosby, had a very close relationship, very close friendship. And effectively, they invented brutalism or new brutalism between them. And in the background of this, you can see, sorry, on the right-hand side, you can see Alison and Thea Crosby where they lived in Doughty Street in London, in Bloomsbury. And in the background is a design by Theo Crosby for a house, which he actually built in 1952 in London. And he moved into it when they split up and they wanted to, Alison and Peter Smithson wanted to start a family. But at the same time, sorry, I'll go one ahead and then I'll flip back. At the same time in 1952, Alison and Peter Smithson designed this what was more famous house in Soho in London, in which they first used the term the New Brutalism in December 1953. So this is the first issue of AD magazine that Theo Crosby was responsible for. And in that first issue, he published his best friends, Alison and Peter Smithson, and he used the term, Peter Smithson used the term the New Brutalism. So it was effectively born, the New Brutalism was born in AD magazine at this time, in December 1953. The Smithsons were famous young avant-garde or neo-avant-garde architects in the post-war years in Britain. They were central to the independent group at the Institute of Contemporary Arts. They put together the exhibitions Parallel of Life and Art in 1953 with artists. And they were also probably most famous for winning this competition for the Hunstanton Secondary Modern School in Norfolk, which was the most avant-garde school design at the time. They were very, very young. I think they were only about 25 years old when they won this competition, this big competition, which was published widely in AD and AR, for example. And it was included in Rayner Banham's definitive book, The New Brutalism, which he published in 1966, but came out of his article, The New Brutalism, that he published in the Architectural Review. So Rayner Banham was kind of the enemy. He was on the other side. He was on the Architectural Review, and he published this famous article called The New Brutalism in December 1955, which was actually 11 whole months after the Smithsons published their manifesto as an editorial to the architectural design of January 1955, where they tried to explain what they meant by the New Brutalism with Theo Crosby in this editorial of January 1955. But it was quite cryptic and quite difficult to understand, and it didn't really take on. And Rayner Banham was an incredibly talented communicator of architectural ideas and historian. And he became famous for his definition of the New Brutalism that he published in December 1955 and went on to produce the definitive book in 1966, which did include the architecture of Alison and Peter Smithson, including the Hunstanton School as the first example of the New Brutalism. So AD, in summary for that little section, AD Architectural Design was the magazine that through which brutalism or the New Brutalism was brought to architects and the public in 1953. I'll go back, I'll start there.
OK， 那么在Monica 之后呢，接任他作为 AD 杂志的编辑是 Theo Crosby。那么 Crosby 他在一战期间在意大利进行了学习，那么在战争结束之后回到了英国，实际上就把一些古典主义的内容或者说是观念带回到了英国。当然他在意大利的时候也认识了非常重要的两个人物，是 Alison and Peter Smithson，他们是一对夫妻，当时是男女朋友。那么他们在英国的这个居所也是非常重要的。当然在这张图片后边这张图纸是 Crosby 在 Bloomsbury 的一个房子的设计。那么在1952年的时候做的一个房屋，也是他自己的自宅。 那么在后面我们提到Addison and Peter Smithson 其实主要是基于他们俩对于 AD 杂志提供的一些设计的这个稿件，以及他们在创作的过程中提出的一个新的概念或者说建筑的一个定义，就是 the New Brutalism。那么在这个页面中，我们可以看到 AD 杂志在1953年的期刊里面发表了他们的一个竞赛获奖作品，在当时他们可能是20多岁的时期，在英国的建筑师里面他们是属于比较先锋的。那么在这个建筑的设计里面，获得了优胜，也是这个 Secondary Modern School。那么在这个建筑里面，其实是用到了这个关于 Brutalism 的一种设计。那么在后面一页 ，yes exactly。在这一页里面，在1953年也是 Crosby 第一个负责编辑的第一个期刊，他刚刚上任编辑，在12月份的这个期刊里面也发布了 Smithson 的这个 House in Soho 在伦敦 SOHO 地区的一个建筑设计。那么这个建筑设计里面其实也是运用了他们关于粗野主义的一种方法。但是非常值得讨论的是，在1955年的时候，有专门的一个专篇是讲，或者说是他们尝试在 Crosby 尝试定义的 New Brutalism 的过程中呢，其实这个文章没有得到特别好的重视，或者说它没有特别得到这个认定。那么在后期我们知道的 Ryan Bannon 他写了一本书，是在1966年发布的《The New Brutalism》。那他是一个非常敏感的、善于组织叙事的一个历史学家，和作者。那么在这篇文章里，他也囊括了前期在1953年、1955年时期，这个 Smithson 他们的作品，包括他们的一些定义。但是这本书其实更好的去得到了关注，或者说是从某种意义上得到了认可。
我再补充一些细节哈。那个他说呢，就是第4个这个主编是叫 Theo Crosby， 这位是从南非来的，他是个子非常高，开坦克，二战的时候开坦克。然后呢，很快就结束以后，他就想学建筑，去意大利等等等等啊。然后呢，就撞到了认识一个人，然后就成为好朋友。这就是 Peter Smithson 和 Alison Smithson， 就是夫妻2个。然后这2个人呢是Durham University 的学建筑的，那个 Durham 就是纽卡斯尔是一个大学啊。然后纽卡斯尔 Durham 现在分开了，所以这个建筑学院现在在纽卡斯尔，就是 Peter Smithson 是纽卡斯尔的毕业生。说不好意思啊，我们推广一下。不过他刚才说了这个细节了啊。就 Peter Smithson 是纽卡斯尔的一个博士生毕业生啊。当然那个时候纽卡斯尔当然是一个大学啊。OK。还有一个很重要的关键就是 Crosby 的他编的杂志就刊登了这个 Peter Smithson、Alison Smithson 他们的得奖的作品。那么他们很年轻，20几岁得奖，然后呢，他们就在 AD 这个杂志上，在1953年的9月和1955年的1月都提出了一种叫 New Brutalism， 但是他们写的呢。但是后来就是有个叫 Rayner Bannon， 在1955年的12月，在他的 AAR 上面也写了 New Brutalism， 但他写的比 Peter Smithson 更会写，他是个史学家，更会说话，更会写，所以人家都把这个 Brutalism 好像是从 Rayner Bannon 那出发的。其实 Rayner Bannon 比这个 Smithson 晚得多啊，晚了十几个月吧啊。那么然后呢，就是 Rayner Bannon 呢，在1966年又出了一本书叫《New Brutalism》，所以呢，大家都把它看成是 Rayner Bannon 那边出来的。但是作品呢，他还是认可的，就是 Rayner Bannon 还是认可 Peter Smithson 的第一个叫 Stanton 那个 Primary School 那个作品，那个小学那个作品是粗野主义的第一个作品啊。Sorry， 又加点细节啊。Steve。
Okay, thank you. So we see here quite early on this idea of agonism, or a struggle between the two magazines, Architectural Review and Architectural Design, trying to claim the New Brutalism, which was the big new post-war architectural movement in the UK and ultimately in the world, in the Western world at least, trying to make a claim for it for their own magazine. But AR, Architectural Review, became famous for it, but it was actually first promoted and invented in the Architectural Design. I mentioned the independent group. Theo Crosby he was basically a sculptor. That's what he loved to do. but he qualified as an architect. But he loved to continue sculpting and art, and he was involved in the independent group at the Institute of Contemporary Arts, and he published a lot of his friends' work, such as John McHale, Magda Cordell, Eduardo Paolozzi, and so on. He published their work through AD, architectural design, in the 1950s. And also the exhibitions that they produced, for example, Parallel of Life and Art, which is quite famous now, from 1953, which was headed by the Smithsons. And after the independent group dispersed in 1956, Theo Crosby brought together the groups, the people, to create This Is Tomorrow exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery in London in 1956. At the same time, we have to remember that AD, it was still supported by advertising. It was still all about connecting component manufacturers, building component manufacturers with architects. And they produced these catalogs still. AD was still considered a sort of byproduct of these catalogs. And they started to impinge on the pages of AD itself. So obviously they carried advertising, but they also created this product index alongside these kind of high-minded cultural articles that Crosby was producing from the independent group. In 1961, the UIA, the Union of International Architects Congress, was held in London in 1961, as I said, on the south bank of the Thames, where the Festival of Britain had been. And Theo Crosby, Monica Pigeon sat on the organizing committee, and Theo Crosby got the job to design the buildings for the Congress. And he employed his independent group friends, Edward Wright, for the typography. This was a temporary building that he went to the building product manufacturers for sponsorship, and they gave him some free products, and he basically made these buildings for that. The contractor, Taylor Woodrow, was so impressed with the buildings that he produced that they offered him a job, and that's when Theo Crosby left AD after 8.5 years in 1962 to work at Taylor Woodrow on a Euston Station in London project, which was an enormous project in Euston Station. But the government forbid any more office development at a certain time, and that was stopped. So the project, the enormous project that he was working on was stopped. He'd left AD by this time, but he'd actually employed all of the members of Archigram. So Warren Chalk, Peter Cook, Dennis Crompton, and so on, you can see up here on the top right. He'd employed all of these people at Taylor Woodrow, and when their station project was terminated, they were put on this Fulham study project, which the Archigram group put together, heavily influenced by people like Buckminster Fuller, of course, and Theo Crosby, who was very good at organizing people and events, put on an exhibition called Living in the City, or City Living, which was the Archigram's first kind of exhibition. And he produced a catalogue called Living Arts for this. And basically the first few issues of Archigram were produced at Taylor Woodrow's offices in London under Theo Crosby. So Theo Crosby left in 1962 when Ken Frampton became the technical editor of AD. Shall I leave it there for translation?
我们看到刚才的讨论中，Architectural Review 其实通过获得了一些认可，所以它变得非常的知名。而 AD 杂志呢，它依然也是保持它原来的一个主要的风格，或者是主要的目的是希望能够宣传并且是展示建筑的部件和制造商联系这个业内的这个关系。当然，它所以同时有一个非常重要的Product Index 的这个章节是有关于具体的这些广告的。那么在1961年的时候，当时有一个非常重要的一个建筑设计项目是 Union of International Architects 是在英国伦敦的南岸。那么 Crosby 也是主导了这样子的一个设计的工作。那么在那之后，1962年的时候，他就离开了 AD，参与到了英国非常重要的一个火车站Euston Station 的一个设计项目当中。那么在当时呢，英国这个政府其实也是可能是有各种原因不希望有大型的项目的建设，所以这个 station 的project Euston Station project 其实到后来就中断了。那在这个期间，他还在建筑事务所工作的期间呢，他也接触到很多非常我们知名的一些建筑师，包括理论家是来自于电讯派的。那么特别要提到的是，刚才我们也说Crosby 他来自南非，那么他也被在行业中也被认为是一个雕塑家、建筑师，也非常关心当代艺术。那么他在自己工作的期间，也收集了非常多他的朋友的就是他认识的艺术家和艺术圈子的朋友的作品，有非常多的公共艺术装置或者说雕塑类型的这个文章的发表。那么在 Archigram 的这个相关的这个工作中呢，他也组织了第一次就是 The First Exhibition 叫 City Living。这样子的一个杂志，并在这个这样子的一个展览，并在这个展览中形成了一个小的这个展览册，就左边这一个就是City Living， 然后呢，这也是非常重要的一个关于电讯派的一个成果。那么我们从中也可以看出，他也非常善于去组织人物就是这些人物之间的关系，去产生一些去制造一些这样子的展览的场合、活动的场合。62年62年 Ken Frampton 担任了这个AD 的杂志，接任了我们现在所说的 Crosby 的工作。弗兰普顿。
Kenneth Frampton
Okay.
joined. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Steve, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so in 1962, Kenneth Frampton replaced Theo Crosby as the technical editor. He was there very briefly for 2.5 years, and he'll come back into the story later. But he used to work at the London County Council Architects and also at Douglas Stephen and Partners. He had his kind of network based. Well, they all used to meet at this pub in London called the French House Pub, where artists and architects used to meet. You can see photographs of it at the time. And Frampton used to meet his friends, John Miller, Alan Colquhoun, and so on. And he used to go around Europe with Monica Pigeon to Germany and France and so on and see the latest modern architecture. And that's where he claims he got his ideas for critical regionalism at the time. And he was very much less interested in art and more interested in kind of the construction aspects of architecture, as we know from his much later books. But at the time in 1964, Monica Pigeon had the idea of introducing the Architectural Design Awards, Grand Project Awards, she called them, which was an idea copied from the American magazine Progressive Architecture. And this was the first magazine-sponsored award in the UK. They invited, as we all know how awards work and competitions work nowadays, they invited architects to submit the work that was on their drawing boards, and a panel, jurors of Theo Crosby, Erna Goldfinger and Dennis Lasden, decided which would get the awards, the first of which was awarded to Peter Womersley for this Edinburgh transplant surgery unit. Quite a brutalist kind of building, as you can see. But this was the introduction essentially into UK architecture of the idea of project awards, to compete for prizes based on, you know, what the assessors, the jurors thought was the best work. And this is a kind of an object, if you like, in Bruno Latour's terms, that we see continuing through AD magazine as an idea, and that had an impact and an influence on architects and the readers throughout the years. And it kept going away and coming back. The editors, especially Ken Frampton, thought that the work submitted for the awards was absolutely terrible. He hated it. He hated the whole idea of awards. But at the same time, what it does hosting an award, even if you're a relatively small magazine like Architectural Design, it means that you get to say what is good architecture. So you are defining through your juror, a bit like a crit or a review in architectural school, you get to say what is good architecture. And that kind of brings you immense cultural capital, using Bourdieu's terms. So Ken Frampton was only there very briefly. He was lured away to America by Peter Eisenman and Princeton University in 1965, which is another story that I go into in the book, but don't have time here. But he worked part-time at AD, as all of the editors did, and he also worked at Dr Stephen Partners, as I said, and he worked on this building, Corringham in London, which is a kind of part constructivist, part brutalist, very handsome block of apartments, quite exclusive block of apartments in London. And when this was finished and published in AD magazine, he left for America to be replaced by the next technical editor, Robin Middleton, also a South African architect who had done a PhD at Cambridge under Niklaus Pevsner on the French architect Viollet-le-Duc. And Robin Middleton had also worked at Euston Station for Taylor Woodrow under Theo Crosby with the Archigram group. And the next stage of AD is less about kind of the brutalist tectonics of Theo Crosby and Kenneth Frampton and friends, and becomes less involved in buildings as they got bored of the modern construction that was being built in London, and they were more experimental, and we start to see the archigram and experimental architecture emerge in Robin Middleton's time, and I will go on to that next.
刚才我们提到1962年，肯弗兰普顿，他接任了 Crosby 的这个职位，担任 AD 杂志的编辑。那么他在编辑担任的岗位上，其实也是有2年半。那么在这个期间，1964年，举办了一个由 AD 杂志赞助的建筑奖项评选，也是第一个由一个杂志来赞助的一个评选。那么在这个评选中有 Grand Project Awards、Project Awards， 然后 Mention 就是有这种类型。那么他们在收集上来的项目中，最后选择了 Peter Wormsley 在爱丁堡的一个偏这个粗野主义的一个建筑设计。那么他获得了一个最终的奖项。这个奖项的举办呢，其实让大众意识到，包括建筑师和阅读的这个读者，其实我们是有一些建筑项目作为它的个体，实际上是可以去竞争，或者说是是要去进行一个比拼，获得这个奖项，获得这个认可的。那么也通过这种方式，赋予了 AD 杂志去定义什么是好的建筑的一种权利。这是一种史无前例的一个方法，或者说一个现象。那么他们通过评审的这种定义来指引大家，就是或者说是引导大家形成一种什么是好建筑的这种观念，也是我们刚刚提到的，可能作为一种文化资本的积累转化成了一种权利和能量。那么在他之后，1965年到1973年 ，Robin Middleton 在弗兰普顿之后担任了他 AD 杂志的这个编辑。那么他也是来自非洲的一个建筑师 ，Yes, this person， 他在Oxford 进行了学习建筑，然后呢 Cambridge，sorry， 在 Cambridge 读了也是一个建筑师。那么他也是作为一个 technical editor， 就是技术型的编辑。当然，我们之前几位也是被这样定义的。那么他在他的担任编辑的职业生涯中呢，其实更多的也是关注，可以看到他更多关注一种实验性或者说是一种讨论性的建筑的定义。那么在后面一张这个slide 里面，我们可以看到它跟 Archigram， 包括我们刚才提到的 Ryan Banham 以及各类的活跃在建筑议题讨论中的人物都是有联系的。Okay. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I just want to quickly mention these graphs on the left-hand side. I don't know if you can see the dates, but these graphs go from 1954 on the left to 1974 on the right. The red line represents AD and the yellow line represents Architectural Review. The bottom graph is the amount of advertising in the respective journals, and the top graph is the circulation or the number of readers that they had. And as you can see, the top graph shows that AD actually beat the Architectural Review for 1 year only, 1968, when Robin Middleton was technical editor, in terms of circulation. It just beat it in terms of circulation. But it was always behind in advertising. And even though the Architectural Review was very rich and didn't need that money to maintain its presence, and AD did need the advertising money, AD was always second best to the AR in terms of advertising. But you can see the peak of advertising was around 1961 for both magazines. That was the peak of number of adverts in the magazine. And this is important because the number of adverts directly relates to the amount of money that the magazine makes, the success of the magazine, and without adverts, the magazine can't function. And you see that in 1970-ish, 1971, the red line on the bottom graph, that under Robin Middleton, AD got rid of adverts altogether. It became effectively a little magazine that only relied on circulation subscription for its survival. And that became good for Robin Middleton because he wanted to experiment. And when you experiment in a magazine, the advertisers don't like it. But also bad because they had to kind of obviously get more readers. And AD was a much more international magazine than AR. AD had 70% of its readers abroad, overseas, whereas the AR was more focused on Britain, which meant that advertisers liked the AR because they knew who they were advertising to was located in the UK, whereas you were advertising a product to someone in America or Chile or South Africa, and obviously the advertisers didn't like that as much. So it's an unspoken story of magazines, of the advertisers and the circulation, the subscribers, of how magazines actually survive and exist. Anyway, back to the relationships and the networks. Yeah, Robin Middleton, this is a very quick diagram of how all these people were related. Obviously, the world of architecture is very small and everybody knows everybody else, especially at that time in London. But there were these kind of two sides. There was the Architectural Review side and the Architectural Design side. They were friendly rivals, competitors. And the Archigram Group, as I said before, worked alongside Robin Middleton for Theo Crosby at Taylor Woodrow in London in those early 1960s. The first issue of the magazine that Robin Middleton put together was in February 1965, which focused still on the Smithsons. The Smithsons were still very fashionable, and this magazine was dedicated to the Economist cluster in London. I think the Smithsons' best building, and Ken Frampton wrote the review of this building. It was his last piece for the AD. And this is actually also the last building that appears, or the penultimate building that appears in Rayner Banham's book, New Brutalism. So he considers it a New Brutalist building because it's by the Smithsons, but actually it's really not a New Brutalist building. It doesn't expose its structure or its services. In fact, it's very much about the concealment and integration of services in terms of kind of the ideas of what New Brutalism stands for. But because it was by the Smithsons, Banham included it in his book. But this was a time, as I said before, that London was becoming boring for architects. They thought the construction was really terrible, that the way that modern architecture was going. And Archigram, in one of Robin Middleton's first issues in November 1965, he published a piece on Archigram with some words by Rayner Banham, but also words by the Archigram Group, and introduced Archigram as a phenomenon to British architects. They had appeared in national press and in a French magazine before that, but AD was the first to publish Archigram to British architects. And as Robin Middleton was there from, 1965 to 1973, throughout his tenure at AD, he continued to promote Archigram and other experimental avant-garde architects, including Buckminster Fuller, for example, and his domes were very popular in AD. The space race was happening. The Americans and the Russians were competing for who would get to the moon first and put a man in space. And this was an incredibly popular idea for architects, building this self-contained hermetic world where man could live in alien environments. And possibly Middleton's most famous contribution to AD magazine was this section called Cosmorama, which effectively grew out of the news column in AD in 1965 and took over the whole of AD magazine, because he basically took excerpts and ideas from other magazines, not architectural magazines, but financial magazines, scientific magazines, technical magazines, and he kind of served them to architects as ideas for what architects could and should be looking at, and changing architecture from a very kind of pragmatic, construction-oriented magazine into a magazine of ideas. And that's when the advertisers left. That's when they became Little in October 1970. And the nature of the magazine changed into this kind of avant-garde, underground magazine from 1970 that involved experimental architects like Archigram, of course, who were published a lot in AD. And when Robin Middleton left, Peter Murray took over as technical editor, and he continued the same nature of experimental architecture with architects like Cedric Price. He introduced Cedric Price into AD magazine. Cedric Price is very famously the anti-architect, the non-planner, the architect of ideas, who is shown on this cover of October 1970, the first magazine of its Little period, which basically means that it doesn't have any advertising and relies purely on subscribers buying the magazine to survive. So it became a completely kind of avant-garde, experimental, underground magazine for very young student architects now, and quite different from the professional magazine that it started off with. And this worried the Standard Catalogue, its owners, the Standard Catalogue company, because they weren't making any money anymore from adverts. So they started to look for buyers, and they wanted to get rid of the magazine that they'd started 40 years ago.
刚才我们在介绍这个 Robin Middleton， 刚才左边有2张图表，其实最重要的一个点我分析一下，就是它2张图表其实在对比 AD 和Architectural Review 和 Architectural Design 的2个差异。那么上面一张表是它的通行量，或者说是流通量，杂志的数量，然后下面一张表其实是它的广告的数量。那么这里面比较重要的一个点就是他们在1961年都有一个广告数量的巅峰，然后在1971年的时候，也就是在 Robin Middleton 他担任编辑的时候，他决定了在杂志中完全去掉这个广告的这个部分，然后完全依靠这个杂志本身的先锋性去吸引读者，通过大家的订阅来维持这个杂志可以继续运行。所以在1965年的时候，这个应该是他第一个担任编辑的这个杂志期刊。那么在这个里面的封面是在伦敦的一个建筑，在Banham 的这个 New Brutalism 里面，把它也认为是一个新初野主义的建筑，但实际上，这个建筑实际的这个施工，包括它的一个整体的状态，并不符合我们在新粗野主义里面的一些标准，比方说它要暴露它的结构，暴露它本身的一种里面的内部的系统，但实际上这个建筑更多的是一种整合它的基础辅助的系统，然后把它们隐藏起来。所以在这个杂志里面，这个第一期刊是这样子的一种表达。那么在之后，我们说到Robin Middleton 跟 Archigram 的一些关系跟合作，以及他们在实验性上的共同的认知，促使了 AD 杂志也应该说是发布了比较多关于 Archigram 的一些城市概念，包括他们的一些作品，不同成员的一些文章，以及其他人对于 Archigram 这个概念的定义。那么其实它关于 Archigram 的电讯派的一些讨论和思潮是被定义为是一种现象，建筑现象。那么它在法国的国际期刊上当然也有相关的关注和曝光，但是对于在英国的整个建筑界来讲，是 AD 杂志第一次或者说是第一个把电讯派介绍给大家的。那么在他的所有的这个编辑的过程中
，Steve, next slide, please. Next slide.
Thank you.
Spaceship, space race.
Fuller.
Yeah. Stay here.
那么在同样的关于实验性或者说观念性的这个讨论里，他也关注到Blacksmith Fuller 的作品。那么在当时其实是 太空竞技的一个阶段，就是大家都希望去研究一些可以自给自足，能够在一个外星空间或者说是一个非常恶劣空间中自足的一个建筑的形式。那么 Fuller 他就是在研究这样子的一种空间网架，包括去提出一些技术性的挑战的一个人物。那么也在 AD 杂志中得到了一个这个期刊的发表。在1967年的时候，2月份的时候，那么还有一个非常重要的就是刚才有一个 Cosmorama 的一个专篇。Cosmorama 其实它里面包含的内容就不仅仅是关于建筑的，而是关于各类科技社会发展中的新闻。它更多的是告诉大家一些新的变革。那么由于这种在编辑过程中的一个指引性，我们这本 AD 杂志它越来越偏向一种先锋的，然后甚至是 underground 的一种比较小范围的，针对年轻建筑学生的吸引力就越来越大了，因为它一直讨论一些先锋的问题，比较有针对性的问题，比较有创新性的问题。那么在1972年到74年 ，Peter Murray 担任了下一任的编辑。
那个就是那个70年代，主要是那个美苏两霸空间技术的竞争，登月啊什么的，所以呢，这个杂志上也有发表啊，也有影响。然后呢，第7个主编是 Peter Murray， 然后在他的那个推动下，这个杂志变得越来越关注先锋，他完全去掉了那个商业广告，完全是各种先锋的思想吧。然后呢，他刊登那个叫 Cedric Price 这么一个建筑学的一个教授，在 AA 的一个教授 Cedric Price， 他是非常反那种具体的建筑，他都是关于建筑的幻想这种思想。Steve.
Thank you. So yes, Peter Murray was only there for a very short while, a couple of years, and he introduced kind of this ephemeral idea of architecture of Cedric Price, really radical ideas like putting universities into trains to travel around the UK in the Potteries Think Belt, for example. And it was aimed directly at students. It effectively took over from Archigram as the radical architecture magazine for students, especially connected to the Architectural Association in London. But it also really challenged architecture and questioned what architecture should be in many other ways in terms of technologies, materials, processes. It introduced cybernetics and mathematics. It introduced Martin Paulige garbage housing, making housing from waste effectively, and also introduced urgent ideas in the early 1970s. We're talking over 50 years ago now. Urgent ideas of the emerging climate emergency, the climate crisis, and this issue, Designing for Survival of July 1972, introduced sea level rising, carbon dioxide, pollution, and so on, ideas to architects. For a very brief time, architecture was thinking about the climate and the consequences of what we were doing through our design and built environment. But that didn't last very long at all. Architectural design was struggling to stay in business through its new business model, relying only on subscriptions and not on adverts. And the Standard Catalogue Company decided to sell it. They offered it to Robin Middleton and Monica Pigeon to buy, but they didn't want to. And we'll skip over Archie McNabb because we don't know very much about him. But the next technical editor, Martin Spring, who took over from Peter Murray in 1975, basically bought the magazine from Standard Catalogue Company himself. He went around architects, he came into an inheritance, and he bought the magazine to publish himself. He became the editor in 1975, and he brought on board the Australian architect Haigbeck, who he knew from the Architectural Association, and they ran it between them for a year. In 1975, along these kind of very socially minded anarchist principles. Martin Spring thought anarchy was a good way to run the country and the world, and he introduced anarchists like Colin Ward, and so on, to think about a different way that architecture could be run. Unfortunately, it did not sell many magazines, and it came into financial trouble in 1976 when they approached the Academy Bookshop owner Andreas Papadakis, who effectively came into a joint venture with Hagebeck and Martin Spring, in order to buy the magazine and effectively push them out as part of a takeover, if you like. So Academy Editions became the owner of the magazine in 1977 and completely changed it from a very radical underground anarchist style magazine into what we know now as a postmodern magazine from January 1977. And you see the top left black magazine with Arata Isozaki on the cover was the first AD profile, which Charles Jenks wrote about radical eclecticism of Arata Isozaki. And you can see the first few issues of AD from this period, which is essentially the beginning of the postmodern years of AD. And you see the fourth magazine on the top row across called Postmodernism, which was launched in conjunction with Charles Jenks's Language of Postmodern Architecture in 1977. And this is the beginning of the postmodern years. And I know I've been talking for 2 hours now, but there is still 20 years, almost 15 years to go of the AD story. And we just starting the postmodernization and the commodification of architecture in AD in these years. And I will whip through it very quickly after this translation. So where are we? Start there.
那么自从1972年到1974年，是刚才我们说到的 Peter Murray 担任他的编辑。那么在他的担任的期间呢，也是比较短的一段时间，他也联系到非常多，比方说刚才电讯派有 Cedric Price 讨论一些就是把非常先锋的议题，比方说把大学放到火车里，然后环绕整个英国这样巡回，然后也跟 AA Architectural Association 这个学校的联系非常紧密，所以它越来越变得是一种类似于说可以说是无政府主义或者是地下的一种这种讨论一些先锋概念的一个场地。那么它更多的是去质疑或者说是提问我们当时的这个建筑是如何被定义的，如何讨论材料，它的建造过程，它里面的数学几何，如何去应对世界上的污染的问题、自然灾害的问题，一些凸显出来的作为建筑师或者说建筑能够对世界产生什么影响，这些比较先锋的或者说尖锐的问题。但是这个时期非常的短，在之后。AD 杂志就面临了一种这个经济上的，或者说是它的一挣扎，面临破产的一个状态，或者面临无法持续的状态。那么 Standard Catalog Company 就是很想把这个杂志就直接卖掉，那么来摆脱这个杂志本身。在1975年呢，应该是 Martin Spring 他们买了，
很快又给他了一个。
对，经过了一个很快的这个交接过程中，最后是卖给了这个。Papadakis 也就是这个 Academy Bookshop 卖给了他们，作为他们的这个旗下的一个杂志，也就是这里我们看到的。那么在这个过程中，它其实杂志的风格就进行了一个转变，变成了关于后现代主义的一个代表。就是1970年代，1977年之后呢，就发布了一系列的杂志。刚才我们看到
Steve, next slide.
Next slide. 可以看到一系列1977年开始发布的杂志的形象，比方说刚教授提到了第一个杂志是谁来着？对，有一些比较典型的形象，然后第一排第4个就是以 postmodern 为主题的 postmodernism 为主题的讨论。Thanks.
Steve, yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Okay, thank you. So I have 14 more slides to go. Of 15 years of the last few years of AD. So postmodern AD becomes a very different magazine indeed, and part of a bigger ecosystem of publishing that revolved around the Academy Bookshop and Academy Editions. So it was one part of a bigger thing, and society had changed very much from an industrial society to a post-industrial society in Britain in the 1970s. And it became more about services and culture, selling services and culture, than about selling products, which AD had originally started off selling. So AD at this time became, again, a byproduct, but a byproduct of culture rather than a byproduct of products, like building products. And this is effectively the postmodernization of AD, when it became part of academies' efforts to sell publications mainly. Papadakis was involved, was a bookseller, book publisher, and had a bookshop. Ways, through exhibitions, through publications, through symposia, and through the awards program again. But there are four effective phases. If we take Charles Jenks, who became involved with Academy and Papadakis at this time to sell his books. Charles Jenks was a very wealthy American who did a PhD under Rayner Banham at the UCL in London in architectural history. He was an incredibly charismatic and knowledgeable and intelligent personality in the architecture scene. And he had a specific way of thinking about architecture. But he invented this term postmodern architecture, and his book, The Language of Postmodern Architecture, was published by Academy Editions in 1977, alongside this postmodernism issue of AD. And this was postmodernism. Effectively, you can see it as four distinct phases. The first of which is radical eclecticism, which is approximately between these years of 1976 to 1980. And this saw the promotion of Charles Jenks's ideas of postmodernism as completely eclectic. Like, you could bring in traditional architecture, classical architecture to sit alongside modern architecture, and this idea of language, the language of architecture, to generate architectural form. And it was all about architectural form that replaced the kind of social ideas of Martin Spring, and created these images that could be published and therefore sold. And at the end of this first phase in 1980, AD moved to this bigger villa called Leinster Gardens in London. Ian Latham became the new technical editor in 1980. And Academy and AD branched out into more publications like the News Supplement and AD monographs to focus on architects' monographs, which was effectively the beginning of vanity publishing. And it started hosting exhibitions in this new headquarters, postmodern headquarters that it had set up. For example, Quinlan Terry, the classical architect, was the first exhibition it hosted. And this second one, 6 British architects, curated by Charles Jenks to promote postmodern architects, Piers Goff, Jeremy Dixon, James Gowan, John Outram, Edward Jones, and Terry Farrell. So that's the first phase, effectively, of postmodernization of AD and architecture and the promotion of architecture. And it's worth mentioning that Charles Jenks was very, wrote and talked in a very kind of battle manner, in a very military manner, that he was advancing the ideas of postmodernism against the old ideas of modernism, and wanted to replace modernism completely with this new form of architecture. The second phase I will briefly mention before going on to the third. Postmodern classicism, roughly again 4 years from 1980 to around 1984, focused more on exhibitions, but also the introduction of classical ideas into architecture. And AD promoted classicism in all sorts of forms, neoclassicism, postmodern classicism, but also traditional classicism that Leon Krier and Dimitri Porphyrios, who were two very important contributors at this time, they hated the idea of postmodern classicism, which they saw as just dressing up, facadism, and kind of commercial type of architecture. And they wanted to return more to a traditional classicism that was about tectonics and the original language of essentially Greek and the ancient world architecture. But AD itself started to focus more on exhibitions and cultural projects rather than building projects. And so we see, for example, the Beaux-Arts in the bottom left of this screen was a big exhibition from the Museum of Modern Art in America that came over to the Architectural Association in 1978. And Roma Interrotta, which was, again, postmodern architects putting together a map of Rome in a very kind of postmodern collage way. And the other aspect is awards. So the Academy Awards that started in 1964 briefly went away, but then came back with Papadakis. And when the RIBA failed to put on an exhibition at the last minute, Papadakis stepped in and got together the architects who had submitted projects to their Academy Awards in 1981, 1982. And he curated an exhibition of all of the contributions to these awards programs and published this huge book, British Architecture, in 1982, and put on a huge exhibition at the RBA, including the first ever Zaha Hadid Award, which he gave a gold medal to in 1982. And finally, for this last period, back to the idea of agonism, Kenneth Frampton has actually moved to Columbia in New York by this time, but he's still very involved in AD. And he's been writing the book Modern Architectural Critical History, which Robin Middleton commissioned for Thames and Hudson in 1970. And it finally got published 10 years later in 1980 as this book. And we see this critic, Robert Stern, write in Skyline a really irritable, horrible review of Ken Frampton's book, which is quite surprising because they were both like neighbors in the same faculty in Columbia University. And they really had very different ideas. And this came from the fact that Stern, with Paolo Portoghese, oversaw the Venice Biennale in 1980, the first large exhibition that continues to this day, which was based around postmodern ideas and tried to promote postmodern classicism in Venice, obviously. But Kenneth Frampton was part of that organizing committee with Robert Stern, and Kenneth Frampton dropped out because he saw postmodernism was just not the thing that he wanted to promote. It was not his definition of architecture. So he dropped out, and in revenge, we see this idea of a struggle of what architecture should be again. Robert Stern wrote this horrible review of Frampton's book, Modern Architecture, in the IAUS Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies in New York. They published this paper called Skyline, and this review was printed there. I'll go back, there's quite a lot to take in there, and then I'll finish with the last two phases.
提到 AD 在1980年代以后，1976年到1980年，1980年到1984年，这两个阶段其实经历了不同的一个对于建筑概念的讨论。也就是说，我们刚才说的 Architectural History through the Museum， through the Magazine， 就是从这里可以见到，就是 Radical。这个应该是激进折中主义吧，在这个里面呢，我们讨论到的非常多表现都是围绕建筑的一个语言。那这个语言本身其实是跟它的形态有关系，而不是一种社会观念或者说是我们之前讨论的一些议题的内容了，它又进行了一个转变。然后在这个时期比较重要的是 Ian Latham 在1980年到1982年担任了编辑。那么在这个期间也有新增的这个 AD 的一些补充的出版物产生。包括了其中一个非常重要的内容是关于6个英国建筑师 British Architects， 然后这些人物代表了这个激进折中主义在建筑设计和建筑本身的这个建筑物上面的一些体现。然后在下一个阶段 Postmodern Classicism 是在1980年到1984年。那么在这个期间，其实它更多的是在讨论一些艺术项目，比方说1980年我们第一个最大的威尼斯双年展，它其实是基于这个威尼斯的一些关于 postmodern classicism 的起源。对 ，yes， 那么在这里面有很多不是起源，就是一种表现。但是这个过程中，我们有各种各样关于比方说 Beaux-Arts 然后 Neoclassicism、postmodern classicism 等等这样子的一些论述，都是在 AD 的期刊里围绕这个主题展开的。那么也可以看到， 在这个期间，我们的很多讨论也会涉及到对于postmodern 的定义。那么这个 postmodern 的 classism 的定义也是来自于 AD 在这个时间一系列的这样子的刊物和文章。那么刚才我们在整个讨论的过程中，也涉及到了很多其他的内容，比方说。提到的Frank Purdon， 他其实已经到了哥伦比亚，在哥伦比亚大学就职。那么他作为一个历史学家和这个批评家、写作者，那么他也发布了关于Modern Architecture a Critical History， 然后包括他的一些论著。那么GDN， 这篇文章应该也是在 AD 上吗？是在 AD 上吗？就是这边有一些关于就是modern architecture 的一些批判性的讨论，那么也围绕这些重要的人物，比方说弗兰普顿，他对这个批判性的建筑的历史，或者说是翻译成对现代主义的一些讨论啊。然后这篇文章对。
他介绍了就是那个 Robert Stern 和 Kenneth Frampton 的，因为他们都是同一个建筑学院里面的同事啊，在哥伦比亚大学。他们互相认识，但是呢，Kenneth Frampton 这本书发表以后，Robert Stern 给他一个非常严厉的批判的那种态度。那么原因可能就是在那个1980年那个威尼斯双年展那个后现代那个展里面，那个 Frampton 呢一开始是介入的，后来就撤出来了，因为他好像反对这种后现代建筑吧，所以他们两个好像是意见是完全是不一样的。反正就是展现了这种具体的人和人之间的关系和对那种各种建筑立场的看法吧，反正是有各种纠葛吧，啊，然后各种地点，哥伦比亚大学、纽约的啊、英国伦敦的啊，这个威尼斯各种关联性吧，啊 ，OK，Steve。
Thank you. Okay, so the last couple of stages. I think it's worth noting that it's quite good having translators because I get to think and reflect on what I've just said. It's worth noting that Papadakis started to curate exhibitions and create discussions and symposia in order to publish it. So the architectural discourse, especially in this magazine, became more about culture and less about buildings, essentially, at this time. And Papadakis was controlling it. Although he wasn't an architect, he actually got a PhD in nuclear physics. But he was in charge and owned Academy Editions, and he ran AD and Academy in a very kind of ad hoc, loose, kind of academic way, really. Very different to how it had been run under Monica Pigeon and so on. And he consulted a lot of people to think about what architecture should be, and published that as a kind of agonism itself, in a way. Postmodernism was very unfashionable and remains very unfashionable in British architectural discourse. But at this time, in the late 1970s and 1980s, architecture was, the center of architecture had moved effectively from London to New York. And this is why people like Bob Stern and academics like Ken Frampton moved to New York. And Peter Eisenman at the IAUS. So there was a kind of rivalry between New York and London for the kind of the cultural capital of what architecture should be. And it had largely moved across to America by this time. So there was a kind of rivalry and a competition for this architectural culture. And Academy Editions was a very large part of the London base, alongside the Architectural Association, the school. So the next third phase of postmodernism in AD we can see is what I call the new classicism, from around 1984 to 1988. And this is when Papadakis started to introduce discussions at Leinster Gardens, at the postmodern headquarters, Leinster Gardens. He produced another magazine called Art and Design. He was expanding his publishing empire, wanted to move into art, not away from architecture, but he wanted to include art and design as well. And these architects, Leon Krier and Dimitri Porphyrios, became very influential. They were traditionalist, kind of what someone's called retrotopian, looking towards the past for influence rather than the future architects. Leon Krier didn't build anything for a long, long time. He proudly said he was an architect because he did not build. But Papadakis started to get people together from 1984 to talk about architecture, and he recorded it and he transcribed it, and he published those discussions in the magazine AD and in Art and Design. And a focus at this time was on Prince Charles because he's now King Charles III of England, of the UK. But at the time in the 1980s, he just married Diana famously. He was very popular because of that. And he had his own opinions on architecture, which he talked about at the RIBA awards ceremony. And he basically said architects and architecture in the UK is just a disaster, it's terrible. And there was this extension proposal for the National Gallery, which Arons Burton Korolek, ABK, had won the competition for. And Prince Charles said this was a disaster, it cannot get built. And he stuck his nose into architectural debates, which was a good thing in the fact that it started to appear on television and in newspapers, but a bad thing for the architects themselves who had won this competition and then ended up not getting the job. So Papadakis started these discussions at AD based largely on Prince Charles's interventions, and because that was introducing more traditional classical ideas into what was a very modernist profession. Then the final phase of postmodernism in AD we can call deconstruction from 1988. Now this was a completely new idea, and the whole idea of pluralism, effectively what Charles Jenks and Papadakis were arguing for was pluralism, that many different kinds and styles of architecture should be published and produced alongside each other. And this person in the bottom left, this woman called Catherine Cook, was an academic who had done a PhD in Russian constructivism and suprematism. And she linked the USSR and Moscow with London and the Architectural Association and Academy editions. And she was an expert in constructivism and started producing these wonderful issues of AD on avant-garde from the early 20th century architecture from the USSR, from the 1918 revolution, which had never been seen before, or very rarely seen in the West. And she produced these amazing issues, which were very influential on people like Rem Koolhaas and Zaha Hadid. And then the idea of deconstruction came from New York, from Philip Johnson and an exhibition he was putting together at the Museum of Modern Art, which they called deconstructivism. But word came from America via Charles Jenks that this was happening, that it was somehow related to Jacques Derrida's ideas of deconstruction. And we get this confluence of two ideas, constructivism and deconstruction, coming together to create this rather strange hybrid called deconstructivism, which appears. And Academy was actually the first to promote deconstruction and deconstructivism before the Museum of Modern Art, because it was so quick and so agile to put this symposium together in March 1988, which it published very soon after in this magazine, Deconstruction, which was incredibly well received and a bestseller. And the symposium itself had people like Bernard Tchoumi, who's Parc de la Villette in Paris. He had Catherine Cook talking about constructivism. It had Zaha Hadid, who was one of the proponents of deconstruction, and Peter Eisenman, who was possibly, along with Bernard Tchoumi, the closest to the ideas of Jacques Derrida and the ideas of deconstruction as translated into architecture. I'll leave it there and then I'll do my conclusion, if that's okay.
OK， 那我们刚刚谈到自1970年到1980年代的这个1970年代晚期到1980年代晚期，其实 AD 杂志的这个讨论的内容很多都是一些建筑师和策展人进入了组织一些论坛或者说展览，然后这些论坛和展览的成果得到了一个出版。那么在这个过程中，有很多关于建筑议题的重心都从伦敦转向了纽约。我们很多的讨论都从欧洲的视角转到了美洲的这个视角。那么这个里面包括了非常多在后现代主义或者现代主义延续下来的重要的理论家和建筑师。那么它越来越多的转化成了一种刚才提到的这个文化资本的一个讨论，如何去积累文化资本。那么这里面有关注的一个主要的定义是 Newclassicism， 也就是1984年到88年期间。那么它的很多的议题讨论是扩展到了文化层面。那么当然它也有一个延伸的杂志叫 Art and Design， 也是希望在 整一个就是 Academy Bookshop 它的讨论不仅仅是聚焦在建筑层面或者建筑的领域，也扩展到艺术和设计的领域。那么在这里面有2个非常重要的人物产生了一些影响，提到了一个 Richardtopia， 就是有一点怀旧乌托邦的这种概念，去看待过去发生的事情，所以它会有一个关于 Classicism 的联系。那么另外一个非常重要的人物是King Charles III， 也是就是之前的 Prince Charles of 王子。那么他后来非常知名的一些影响，也是在于他在建筑的讨论中，非常多的暴露在公众的视野下，去发表他对建筑的这个理解和定义。那么在这个过程中，我们对Classicism 这样子的一个在英国的建筑领域的现象，或者说它的一种复苏，会有不同的一种讨论。那么当时在1988年到1992年的这个过程中，又有进入了一个新的讨论的话语，是 constructivism。construction 加上 deconstruction 得出的一个组合词叫 deconstructivism。那这个组合词其实包含了一个建构主义的词和一个解构这个名词或者说一个动词的名词属性，那么形成了一种解构主义。那么在解构主义的讨论中有非常多的代表人物，那么包括我们后面谈到的一些出版物和展览，其中就包括在1988年 Tate Modern就有一个相关的一个展览，邀请到了非常多代表人物。那么这里面人物包括了Peter Asserman Catherine Cook Zaha Hadid 的这些代表的人物还有 Bernard Twomy。然后他们其实在我们所现在定义为解构主义的这些讨论中都是非常有代表性的人物。Thank you.
Steve.
Okay, thank you. Final slides now. So in 1991, so you have to remember that Papadakis was primarily a book publisher. That's what he did. He wasn't an architect. He just wanted to publish things that sold, that made money. And he came back from the Frankfurt Book Festival in 1990, and he'd agreed to sell Academy, the bookshop, the publisher, and AD with it. As long as his other publications, he'd started producing other publications like this UIA one with this deconstruction and an academic journal as well on more philosophical ideas. And he'd sold it all to this German publisher called VCH, and they take over in 1991. They inject a lot of money into the AD, and it becomes this very large, black, effectively redesigned publication, which is a lot more commercial, but it's also continues to be very pluralist, and it talks about new classicism, it talks about Prince Charles's ideas, it talks about postmodernism, pop architecture, and so on. And this one in particular, this issue in particular, Theory and Experimentation, is based on an exhibition and a symposium and a forum. It was an enormous kind of celebration of the 100th profile that Papadakis had published, which appeared in 1992. And it was 3 or 4 days of architectural talks and discussions in London, in a shopping centre, at the RIBA, at the Royal Academy, talking about the latest and greatest ideas in architecture. By this time, it was a lot of the deconstruction architects, including Eisenman and Hadid and Daniel Libeskind, for example, and Tom Main of Morphosis and Lebeas Woods and so on. They were all involved, but the language had become very kind of theoretical, very poetic by this time. And AD, this issue of AD, is basically a transcript of the discussions that they had in London at this celebration of AD. But by the end of the year, VCH had fallen out with Papadakis and they sacked him. He was shown the door. He was not allowed back in. And that's when I finished the book and finish my research on AD magazine when Papadakis leaves, but not before. We see the bottom right there. Papadakis' last issue of AD magazine is Folding in Architecture, where he introduces Félix Deleuze and Guattari, and he introduces computation into architecture, and the whole next period of computational architecture and digital architecture explodes in AD magazine in the 1990s, but after Papadakis' period. And I just want to kind of finish by saying this period, these deconstruction architects, effectively deconstruction was not really a movement at all. It was an exhibition and a publication. But what it did do is it started the trend of Starchitects, who were the same architects who were published and exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art in New York and in AD. And it started this whole idea of architectural branding and icons and Starchitects, like, for example, Daniel Liebeskind and his Berlin Museum, like, for example, Frank Gehry and his Bilbao Guggenheim in 1995. And Zaha Hadid and her kind of amazing career as a Starchitect, if you like. And it kind of, I won't say that AD started this, but AD definitely fueled the fire that helped this trend, this phenomenon to appear in the mid-1990s. And just to conclude, finally, back to my original aims, a theory of architecture is defined. So we've talked about architectural agonism, the struggle to define architecture through these ideas of field and agents and agency and biographies throughout the AD magazine period. If we go back to 1957, John Summerson was searching for a theory of architecture. He gave a speech at the RIBA, which was published in the Reba Journal, called A Case for the Theory of Modern Architecture. And he identified that there was actually no theory. Modern architecture never had a theory of architecture. It was all enthusiastic and propagandist, he said. The authors tend to start with a belief in the new architecture and to write around their belief, supporting them by picturesque and forceful analogies. And we see this all the time in architecture magazines, including AD, that they never really agree on a definition of architecture. It's all about charismatic personality. It's all about talking well. It's all about beautiful drawings. It's all about manifestos. But there is no agreed definition of modern architecture ever. And so I suppose as my last my last slide, I try and define a theory of not modern architecture, I try and define a theory of architecture to be the struggle to define architecture, which is quite recursive, but I kind of like it as a computational analogy. I hope that's not too much to translate.
那么在1991年之后，我们知道 Rapidakis 他们的这个公司其实是一个出版商，是一个书店。那么它其实最多的是为了出版的，所以在1991年，德国的一个公司 VCH 就接手了这个 AD 杂志。那么在1992年到1992年到93年，其实它这个 Black Period 是它的一个重组或者重新定义的一个阶段。那么在这个阶段里面呢，它基本上是偏向一种理论的讨论和一种实验性的这种表达。那么在这个过程中，它1992年有一个非常重要的论坛和讲座和一些活动，在伦敦 RIBA Riba 的这个 Shopping Center 进行开展，就是它比较偏一个理论的讨论。那么这个时候有很多刚才我们提到的，后现代主义之后的这个结构主义的代表人物，或者说相关的人物，比方说 Daniel Liebeskind， 然后我们提到前面的扎哈蒂的这些人物呢，他都参与了这个讨论。实际上，在这个阶段，更多的是带给大家一些话语和活动，这样子的形式去引导偏理论性的建构，偏理论性的定义。那么，在1992年之后呢，杂志里面也更多的去出现了一些关于数字建筑，包括用电脑去进行设计的一些现代的技术手法在建筑界的影响。那么因为1992年之后呢Rapidakis 他就没有再参与这个杂志的这个编辑或者说是工作了。那么后面我们提到了有个 emergence of star architects， 也就是在1990年代中期，我们出现了很多关于明星建筑师的这样子的一种现象，或者说这样子的一种潮流吧。那么代表人物也包括了 Frank Gehry 这样子的建筑师，他非常知名的 Guggenheim 博物馆，以及在扎哈蒂我们提到的他的一些代表作品，都是非常有 影响力的，或者说知名度的。那么，但是最开始我们谈论的这个结构主义，它其实根本也没有形成一个非常明显的定义，或者说确认的定义。它是通过展览、论坛、出版物的方式，试图去讨论建筑应该如何被定义，或者这样子的内容如何被定义。所以我们在后面那个教授引用了 John Thomason 的一个段落，一个 quotation， 是认为其实我们在定义现代主义的这个过程中，始终没有达到一种大家都 agree 的 definition 是没有的 non-agreed definition， 所以一直是通过不断的书写和就是精致的图片，非常震撼人心、非常有感染力的这些建筑图像的表达，试图去形成一种自己认为可信的理念，或者说自己认为可信的一种说法。那么最后 the final slides，教授认为呢，我们的建筑其实就是通过刚才我们提到的建筑领域的 agency， 然后包括各种不同的人物和参与者的网络，他们进行的一种书写、文本、杂志各种方式去斗争，或者说去对抗，通过这种对抗来试图定义建筑。就是建筑是通过这个对抗的过程来定义的，或者说是斗争的过程来定义的。Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Steve, so much for your amazing, spectacular history of AD and almost a history of shifting ideas of the post-war world, not just UK, but almost everywhere else. As a consequence.
I'm sorry it's taking so long.
Yeah, it is really exciting and spectacular, the research that you present, and it's also very novel and new because it's a special angle. It's not about theory in itself, but about the production of theory through printed magazines and networked social activities, and also geopolitical, not just geographical connections, at least Venice, London, New York, and elsewhere. So it is really, really interesting. Now, Steve, do you, now because we're running out of time, and maybe we should just have a short period of, short time of some conversations. Should I ask some audience if there are some questions? Because we have people, we have Guang Hui Ding from America, your friend and student.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi.
And we have somebody from Liu Yisi from Tsinghua University, and also our PhD student from Newcastle, and as well as my student in Hangzhou. 丁光辉或者刘医师，你们两位要不要？刘医师你在吗？刘医师你在吗 ？OK， 丁光辉在吗？大家有什么马上想问的问题？这个课是非常的精彩啊！这是他这本书的第一次对外的讲座啊，内容很充实啊，要很长时间去消化。然后我估计我们会有很多问题啊，我觉得他的讲座给我们提出了一个全新的关于建筑思潮的发展的一个角度，它不是从理论内部去讨论，而是去看理论的外部的建造的一个过程啊，通过杂志，通过活动，通过地缘的关联，比如说威尼斯、伦敦啊、纽约啊，各种人际关系，这种外部的社会的活动，去创造一种建筑话语啊，而且是个波澜壮阔的一个历史给我们展现了。好，现在大家有什么问题吗？丁光辉有什么问题吗 ？Are you there? I think they are probably. 啊，来了，你来问啊。Okay. So Steve, we now have a question from Professor Chen Lichao, professor from China Academy of Art. In Chinese first, yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Steve. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah. Hello. 我觉得其实我觉得这个我也是想跟同学们说啊，其实就是说，Stephen 教授他讲的这个啊，他其实是从另外一个视角，就是从他对杂志的研究的视角来讨论这个历史的这个其实视角是很独特的，就是你们可以学习一下，很多同学可能不会觉得从这个视角也可以写出一部跟我们所谓的正史不太一样的一种历史的这种 评论观点啊，这个是特别有意思，我觉得。而且让我觉得学习了很多这种，包括像提到的前面的像Ellison Peter Ellison 夫妇，他们本身就在那个现代主义历史上是非常有名的，像包括 CIAM 他们的，还有包括 Team 10这个团队，他们都是在英国属于代表的人物啊。其实就是把所有的都串起来了。这个其实特别好。那么我就是一个问题，就是你的讲座的题目里提到的 Agonism 第二个词那个激进，跟后面提到的激进折中主义的 Radical 这两个激进到底是有什么区别？这个是我的一个问题。对。
Professor, I will do a little bit translation, try to deliver the question in English. So, Professor Chen Lichao shared his feelings with our students that your lecture was very inspiring because you provide a possible approaches or perspectives through the magazine to recreate or trying to review the field of architecture and trying to talk about to create a narrative of architecture history. So Professor Chen Lichao is encouraging students trying to understand there's a different method of research and how to understand the process that architecture is developed and theory is developed. And his question is about the translation of your lecture topic, agonism is similar in Chinese with the translation of radical. So how you kind of differentiate that if in the original language or in your definition?
Yeah, I mean the question is agonism, the meaning of agonism in relation to one of the period in postmodern movement, radical eclectivism. Yeah, the question is, are they related in some ways? Agonism and radical position in some of those positions, such as radical eclecticism.
Thanks for the question. It's not something I thought about, and in English they're not related. The word radical in English comes from a Latin root, which means a root, like a plant's root, something like underground, and something that is something grows from something, if you know what I mean. So radical comes from that sense, but it means something completely, I suppose, alternative, and very aggressively alternative in English. Agonism is from a Greek root, so it's from a different language, and effectively just means struggle. Sometimes I use the word struggle, or sometimes I use the word battle or fight, but it just means a struggle. The words protagonist and antagonist in English come from the same derivative, and the word agony, as in pain, also comes from agonism. But it's not a very well used word in English, agonism, and by it I just really mean struggle, which is, I suppose you could think of radical as quite oppositional. Maybe we can think of agonism as a struggle and radical as an opposite in those senses. Radical in the sense of radical eclecticism was used by Charles Jenks to differentiate it from what was known as weak eclecticism in the Victorian period in Britain, when they had many different styles that were very similar essentially, but they said they were different. Whereas Charles Jenks used the word radical to mean, I suppose, strong, very strongly eclectic rather than weakly eclectic. So it's an interesting idea, but sadly it doesn't translate into the English context.
Okay, yes, I'll do a little bit translation in Chinese. 所以刚
Thank
才
you.
我们理解的这个问题，就是陈老师提到的这个，在我们的中文翻译里是一个激进主义建筑学和一个激进折中主义的一个关联性，然后他怎么来区分这两个词的在本意上的定义？那么Parnell 教授回答是这两个词的词根本来的来源不一样。那个 radical 其实来自于拉丁的一个词根，而 Agonism 它是来自于一个希腊的一个词汇，那么它本身所关联的词汇，就比方说是刚才经常用到的 struggle 就是挣扎，以及对抗，以及我们的 agony 就是引申出一种痛苦的一种状态，它是一个艰难的过程。那么 radical 它的词根其实是 root， 就是它的根，它从根源里，所以它的词义有2种解释，它的本意可能是一种根本的本质的，但是在提到我们刚才所说的这个激进折中主义的时候，其实是用了这个 radical 这个词去区分维多利亚时期一种风格叫折中主义。那么用 radical 发在它前面，表示它是一种更加夸张的，某种程度上更加激进的、区分更加大的折中主义。所以它并不是说这2个词有一些真正的关联啊，可能在英文里面它是完全不同的两种内容。
好，那个各位观众、听众，还有什么人要提问啊？我们时间
I know there are a couple of comments in the
Yeah,
chat,
please,
and
please.
Guang Hui Ding left a comment because he had to leave.
Okay. Yeah, do you want to reply?
And in person? Yeah, I think he said, I would like to raise the question of how magazine...
Yeah, go ahead.
It's in the chat. Can you see it? Guang Hui Ding said, thanks for your presentation and for organizing. I enjoy the many ideas discussed in the talk. I'd like to raise the question of how a magazine functions as a tool of cultivating critical culture. But unfortunately, I'm a sleeve. Do you want me to answer that question of how a magazine functions as a tool of critical culture? Well, I suppose that is the central concern of the theory of agonism, I suppose, that the magazine, whether it's digital or in paper, printed on paper, is a platform effectively for criticism. It's a platform for arguing about what architecture could and should be. And I suppose that's the heart of what I'm arguing for myself. I'm arguing for thinking about architecture as this struggle to define what architecture is. The thing about AD was that it was produced not in order to have a platform for critical culture. It was produced to make money, effectively. That's why AD was produced in the first place, for architects, building product manufacturers, and ultimately in postmodernism for selling of books, basically. So AD was effectively all the time an advert for other things, really, which it was kind of a Trojan horse for getting critical culture to architects. It was, and it became this platform for discussing what architecture could and should be, just like any other magazine, but in a slightly different way. There is a comment above Guang Hui Ding's comment that asks about a comparison between Eastern and Western magazines, which I think is a really interesting, would be a really interesting research project, because she says that the magazine that she studied did not depend on advertising, or did not require any kind of financial support. And if you think of that like the little magazines that Beatrice Colomina studied, and you don't need a kind of financial support for the magazine to exist, then of course it can become anything you want it to be. It doesn't have to please advertisers. It doesn't have to please the people who are funding it, which is the power of kind of little magazines, and I suppose the power of state-sponsored magazines as well. So if it's state-sponsored, then it's it's a message from the state. If it's a completely underground magazine, which could be a radical magazine, that's a very literal translation of radical. Underground, something that's not consented to, that's kind of trying to change things from underneath, from the bottom up, then it can talk about whatever it likes without censorship and without worrying about losing readers or losing money. So there are different kinds of magazines. There are different types of platforms that are produced for different reasons. And I think maybe another research project, an interesting research project, would be to look at these kinds of platforms, especially in the digital age that we live in now, where there are many digital platforms, of course, where they come from, why they exist, how they exist, and what kind of critical culture they they support and enable, because I think it will be very different depending on the kind of platform that it is. So I think that's all I can stab at the moment. I think it would be an interesting symposium or conference or research project to try and look at these different kinds of platforms and the kinds of critical cultures that emerge from them.
我可以简单翻译一下 ，just briefly translated。刚才有不同的参会人听众在这个语言上去提出了疑问，那么探讨的一些问题其实都是非常有意思的。首先呢，就是作为这个培养批判文化的工具，实际上这个杂志最开始它还是一个宣传产品和制造商的一个目的，为了是赚钱的一个目的，或者说是为了一个非常经济化的目的。那么在过程中，它逐渐发展成了一种讨论建筑话语的一种平台，具有批判性的一个场所，一个文化的一个资本逐渐就积累起来了。那么另外一个朋友提到的是，就是关于不同国家或者不同地区、不同类型的杂志，其实有一些它不需要去满足不用去取悦它的读者，或者不用去满足一些经济上的需求，它更多的可能是有它的这个赞助商或者是由国家发起的，那么它传递一些发起人的这个信息传递一些内容。那么可能下一个非常有意思的一种讨论或者说是研究。可以是围绕在不同领域中不同类型的这种建筑杂志，它是如何去形成的，如何去传播一些话语，或是提供这项平台的，特别是提供一个讨论的平台的，特别是在我们现在这个数字化的时代我们在网上就有非常多的类似的一种平台，也许以后我们可以有一个专项的研讨会，或者说是专题的论坛，是关于这个的。
Okay. Anybody wanting to ask questions? Any questions? 大家还有什么问题吗？我们时间已经不太多了哈。那么要不我们就这样好吧 ？OK。那么我们就因为我们这个课呢，是这个讲座呢是非常的精彩啊，也是他第一次讲，所以他讲的非常长。以后再请他讲，他可能会讲的很短，但你就没有那个料了啊，但料非常多啊。那么，我们希望大家有所收获嘛，然后体会到现代的、当代的学术研究的一种角度啊，越来越不从大师的伟大的作品的角度出发，也甚至不考虑思想的内容，而是考虑思想生产的社会机制啊，从这种角度去研究，可能更深刻、更有批判性啊。然后呢，我们欢迎 Steve Parnell 呢，以后有机会呢。来中国参加会议或者合作这教育教学啊什么的啊，希望我们有这个中英之间或者两校之间有更多的合作啊。那么我们今天会呢就先到此这里结束啊。然后呢，我感谢这个陈立超教授、占星博士的这个合作啊，我们3个人一起努力啊，一起占星的翻译是非常好翻的啊，谢谢占星啊，谢谢陈立超啊。May I just say that we are now running out of time, and it was really an interesting, exciting presentation, a spectacular history from a surprising angle onto the discourse and history of shifting ideas in the West, and also by consequence of the world. Through a very novel approach. So we're very lucky today to be able to get the first presentation from you, Steve. And we're looking forward to reading your book. And we also hope that in the future you will be coming to to China and collaborate with us at CAA in Hangzhou. And we, generally speaking, will look forward to more collaborations between British and Chinese scholars, and especially we hope that you'll be able to help, to contribute more collaborations in the future with CAA. Steve, big thank you to your great lecture again.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for translating. That's an amazing experience.
I also thanked Zhan Xing for translation and Chen Lichao for co-chairing with me. Yeah, Steve.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, Steve, thank you so much. Is it 1 o'clock now?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry it's taken so long.
Yeah.
I've never done it before.
Yeah, let's catch up when I come back, and we'll catch up.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you again.
Nice to meet
Steve.
you all. Thank you very much. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.
Bye bye.
Yeah, cheers.好，我们这会议就到此结束啊，谢谢啊，谢谢大家。